Welcome, weary traveller, to a quiet space where time no longer rushes forward, but instead pools softly like moonlight upon quiet stone. Close your eyes and let the heavy burdens of the waking world slip from your shoulders, falling away like autumn leaves into a gentle waiting river. Breathe in, drawing the cool, still air deep into your lungs, and breathe out, releasing every remnant of tension, every echo of the day. You are safe here, enveloped in the quiet embrace of history. Tonight we journey far away from the glaring lights and endless noise of the modern age. We travel back along the silver threads of time, drifting on a warm, fragrant breeze, until we arrive softly in the year 1734. We find ourselves standing beneath the vast, velvety canopy of the nocturnal sky in the heart of Jaipur. Before us lies the magnificent Jantar Mantar, an observatory not of glass and steel, but of baked earth, plaster, and sacred geometry. It is a slow, peaceful midnight, a time when the world sleeps, but the heavens whisper their ancient secrets to the silent, watchful instruments crafted from the very ground. Let the stillness of this sacred space settle into your bones. The air is thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and cool, settled dust. There is nowhere else you ever need to be, no task demanding your attention. Just surrender to the soft gravity of the past and let the stars guide you into sleep. As you stand quietly at the threshold of this vast starlit sanctuary, allow the slow, gentle rhythm of the nocturnal breezes to wash over your senses. If you find peace within these shadowed courtyards, if the quiet echoes of a bygone era help unspool the tangled threads of your waking modern mind, I warmly invite you to subscribe to this channel. By choosing to linger here with us, by gently tapping the like button beneath this video, you help cultivate a serene haven for fellow wanderers who also seek refuge from the relentless pace of tomorrow. Your support becomes the very foundation of the calm we build together, allowing us to wander deeper into the tranquil corridors of lost history, uncovering forgotten nights and slow-moving centuries across the globe. There is no urgency in this request, only an open hand extended in the velvet darkness, offering a permanent place beside our quiet hearth. Feel free to join our growing community of peaceful travelers whenever you feel ready, knowing that this sanctuary will always remain open forever for your return. For now, however, simply let that thought drift away like a faint wisp of cloud passing across the luminous face of a full moon. Turn your gaze back toward the grand, sweeping arcs of the masonry instruments rising majestically from the earth. The night is young, the air is perfectly still, and the ancient silver stars are just beginning to reveal the slow, majestic poetry of their eternal sweeping dance. As we gently cross the invisible threshold that separates the chaotic, dusty roads of the outer city from the sacred, geometric heart of the Jantar Mantar, the very air seems to shift its weight and alter its texture. The atmosphere within these high, protective walls is no longer a swirling current of the day's frantic energy. Instead, it descends as a heavy, comforting blanket of utter, profound stillness. Beneath your slowly stepping feet, the wide pathway is composed of large, flat slabs of local stone, meticulously laid out by calloused hands centuries ago, hands that deeply understood the profound, lasting importance of a perfectly level foundation. If you were to slip off your shoes in the quiet dark and walk barefoot upon these ancient, fitted stones, you would instantly feel the subtle, lingering memory of the fierce Rajasthani sun. Throughout the long, golden, shimmering hours of the afternoon, these massive paving stones drank in the fiery warmth from the sky, absorbing and storing that radiant heat deep within their dense mineral cores. Now, in the deep, quiet, velvety cradle of midnight, they are slowly, almost imperceptibly, exhaling that trapped warmth back into the cool, settling night air. It is a remarkably gentle, comforting heat, feeling almost like a soft, living sigh rising from the chest of the earth itself, wrapping warmly around your ankles and anchoring your wandering spirit to this precise, tranquil moment in history. The scent rising off the pathway is wonderfully rich and grounding, an earthy perfume woven from the dry, baked clay of the surrounding desert, the faint, sweet dust of pulverized red sandstone, and the delicate, lingering aroma of arid shrubs that have finally surrendered their daytime moisture to the descending evening dew. It is the distinct, heavy fragrance of deep, unbroken time, a scent that speaks of silent centuries slowly turning like a giant, invisible wheel beneath the impassive gaze of the stars. Above us, the moon, a perfect, luminous pearl suspended in a vast, fathomless ocean of indigo, pours its liquid silver light over the sprawling, silent complex. The Jantar Mantar, you soon realize as you look around, is not a collection of conventional buildings meant for human habitation. There are no cozy indoor hearths, no heavy oak doors, no windows draped in cloth. Instead, it is a magnificent architectural dreamscape composed entirely of massive, abstract, and perfectly calculated shapes. There are sweeping, monumental arcs, towering, sharp-edged triangles, and deeply sunken, hemispherical bowls of heavy masonry, all rising organically and purposefully from the flat plane of the earth. In the pale, washing moonlight, these structures take on an otherworldly, almost ethereal quality, looking like the ruins of a city built by geometricians from another older world. The broad surfaces of these colossal astronomical instruments are not left as rough exposed stone, jagged to the touch. Rather, they have been meticulously and lovingly coated in a specialized ancient architectural mixture known to the local builders as cirque. Imagine, for a moment, the profound, painstaking care, the countless unrecorded hours of rhythmic labor that went into creating this beautifully smooth exterior. Master artisans took pure lime, burning it slowly in great roaring kilns until it was as stark and white as old bone, and then mixed it meticulously with the finely crushed powder of perfectly fired terracotta bricks. This damp, heavy paste was then applied to the massive stone skeletons of the instruments, layered on thickly and smoothed endlessly with flat wooden floats. But the devotion to perfection did not stop there. To achieve the flawless mirror-like finish strictly required for exact astronomical measurements, the dedicated craftsmen would polish the drying plaster for days on end. They used smooth, rounded agate stones, cool and heavy in their palms, retrieved from the beds of ancient rushing rivers. When you step close and run your bare hand along the curving, plunging edge of one of these great dials, the surface feels astonishingly cool, dense, and utterly frictionless, possessing the heavy, polished texture of antique ivory or the pearlescent inside of a deep-sea shell. In the pale, washing light of the moon, this polished cirque plaster glows with a soft, pale, almost supernatural luminescence. It radiates a ghostly pinkish-white hue that seems to generate its own faint internal light against the heavy surrounding darkness of the courtyard. As your fingertips trace the sweeping curve of a white marble scale securely embedded within the pinkish plaster, you can vividly feel the microscopic, precise grooves etched deeply into the cold stone. These are the exact demarcations of ancient minutes and seconds, carved by unknown artisans whose names have long since faded into the mists of unrecorded time. These tiny, incised lines were carefully filled with dark lead to make them stand out starkly against the pale marble, creating a beautiful, rhythmic visual pattern of alternating dark and light that stretches endlessly, hypnotically along the curved, sloping arcs of the heavy masonry. Where the direct moonlight strikes these grand, abstract forms, it creates large pools of brilliant, startling clarity, illuminating the dust motes that dance slowly in the silver beams. But where the light is solidly blocked by the massive stone structures, the shadows cast across the Jantar Mantar are not merely faint absences of light, they are deep, profound, and heavy entities in themselves. The shadows pooling in the sunken dials and behind the towering walls are absolute, a velvety, impenetrable, bottomless black that stretches across the stone courtyard like slowly spilled, thick ink. Because these instruments were flawlessly designed to track the precise movements of the sun, their edges are sharp, strictly geometric, and perfectly defined by mathematics. Consequently, the shadows they throw under the crisp, clear, unobstructed light of the full moon possess a razor-sharp, flawless edge. They slice cleanly across the courtyard pathways and climb up the adjacent plastered walls in perfectly straight lines and immaculate sweeping curves. You stop walking for a moment to simply watch as a singular, vast, triangular shadow, cast by a soaring gnomon nearby, lies motionless across the courtyard floor. It is completely, utterly still to the casual waking eye. Yet, if you possess the calm patience of the royal astronomers who once kept their silent, nocturnal vigils in this very spot, if you quiet your breathing, still your racing thoughts, Tanned, stare unblinkingly at the very tip of that dark shadow where it meets the silver-lit stone. You can almost begin to perceive the microscopic creeping movement of the earth itself. The shadow is inching forward, a tiny fraction of a single millimeter at a time, a silent, ghostly, dark hand sweeping endlessly across the pale face of a colossal terrestrial clock. It is a mesmerizing, deeply hypnotic realization that washes over your tired mind. You are quietly witnessing the rotation of the planet, made visible, made entirely tangible by the silent interaction of cold starlight, warm stone, and infinite unbroken patience. Stand perfectly still in this sea of moonlight, and let your ears adjust to the profound, heavy quiet of the observatory. At first, the silence is so absolute, there is nothing to hear but the rushing, oceanic sound of your own blood, the slow, steady, reassuring drumbeat of your own resting heart. But as your senses expand outward into the cool air, the silence begins to gently reveal its hidden, delicate layers of sound. A high, gentle breeze, born somewhere far away in the rugged, darkened Aravalli hills, drifts softly over the high perimeter walls of the Jantar Mantar. It does not howl, and it does not whistle. Instead, it only whispers. As this soft current of air courses smoothly around the sharp, geometric corners of the towering masonry and flows gently over the curved, smooth lips of the sunken hemispherical bowls, the wind creates a soft, low-frequency hum. It is a continuous, deeply resonant vibration that you feel spreading warmly through your chest, just as much as you hear it with your ears. It is the soothing sound of the night wind playing the vast observatory like a giant, silent terrestrial instrument. Accompanying this deep, resonant, calming hum is the faint, dry, papery rustle of a solitary peepal tree standing watch near the outer wall. Its heart-shaped leaves, suspended on incredibly long, slender stalks, tremble and dance rhythmically even in the slightest, most imperceptible stirring of the midnight air. The resulting sound is exactly like the gentle, forgiving patter of a very light, distant summer rain, a soft, rhythmic shushing noise that washes endlessly over the mind, smoothing out all the jagged, sharp edges of conscious thought. Every so often, a single tiny grain of loose desert sand, carried aloft by the drifting breeze, will strike the smooth, polished surface of a marble dial with a microscopic, faintly metallic click. It is a sound so small, so perfectly isolated in the vast, encompassing quiet, that it only serves to emphasize and deepen the overwhelming oceanic scale of the silence that surrounds it. The air here is so flawlessly still, the peace so unfathomably deep, that you can almost hear the silver stars slowly turning on their grand celestial axis, singing a silent, sweeping lullaby that gently coaxes the heavy, waking world into a deep, completely uninterrupted slumber. As we slowly drift deeper into the heart of the silent, slumbering observatory, the wide, pale stone pathway gently guides our unhurried footsteps toward the most magnificent and breathtaking structure within the Jantar Mantar. Emerging quietly from the silver-dappled shadows of the smaller instruments, we find ourselves standing in total hushed awe at the very base of the Brihat Samrat Yantra, the supreme instrument. It is an architectural marvel so undeniably vast, so utterly immense in its quiet, sweeping grandeur, that it feels far less like a building constructed by mortal hands, and significantly more like a solitary, sacred mountain that has been carefully coaxed from the bedrock and sculpted by the gentle hands of giants. In the soft, washing, uninterrupted light of the midnight moon, the supreme sundial rises up into the heavy velvet darkness, its absolute highest point seeming to pierce the very fabric of the star-strewn sky. The sheer, overwhelming, dizzying scale of this colossal masonry instrument does not intimidate or frighten the weary mind. Rather, it provides a deeply comforting sense of profound perspective, serving as a gentle, silent reminder of the vast, peaceful universe that holds our remarkably small, spinning world in its quiet, eternal embrace. Let your gaze slowly, effortlessly trace the ascending, sharply angled line of the central gnomon, a towering, perfectly straight wall of solid, unyielding masonry that serves as the beating mathematical heart of this giant silent timekeeper. Running along the very spine of this towering, sloping wall is a steep, impossibly long and beautifully narrow ascending staircase. These ancient weathered steps, climbing relentlessly and smoothly upward at an angle perfectly, flawlessly parallel to the invisible axis of the earth itself, look exactly like a delicate, fragile ladder woven entirely from pale moonlight and deep pooling shadow, offering a direct, silent, and peaceful pathway to the heavens above. Spend a long, unhurried moment visualizing the soft, rhythmic, deliberate tread of the royal astronomers who, just a few short decades ago in this exact quiet year of 1734, would slowly ascend this very staircase in the hushed, deeply solitary hours of the deepest night. Their supple, soft leather slippers would have made only the absolutely faintest whispering sound against the cold, unyielding stone, a soft, repetitive, deeply soothing shh that blended completely seamlessly with the rustling night wind. If you were to gently place your bare hand upon the cold surface of the lowest stone step, you would immediately feel the subtle, smooth, gently sloping depressions worn deeply into the center of the solid tread. This gentle, smooth concavity is the physical, lingering memory of countless dedicated footsteps, the slow, endlessly patient wearing away of solid rock by the persistent, soft devotion of men seeking only to understand the slow, sweeping, majestic dance of the cosmos. The outer edges of each individual step are softly, beautifully rounded, polished by decades of time and human touch to a beautiful, organic, almost fluid smoothness. Where the pale, liquid silver moonlight strikes the flat, horizontal surface of the stone steps, the masonry glows with a muted, chalky, ghostly brilliance, while the vertical rises remain entirely shrouded in a thick, velvety, impenetrable blackness. This creates a mesmerizing, perfectly rhythmic visual pattern of alternating absolute light and absolute dark that gently, inevitably draws your tired eye upward, higher and higher, rung by rung, until the stone staircase seems to simply dissolve and melt away into the glittering, vast canopy of the Milky Way. Flanking this towering, central, moonlit staircase are the massive, gracefully curving quadrants, the sweeping stone wings of the Brihat Samrat Yantra. These colossal semicircular ramps of incredibly heavy masonry plunge dramatically yet smoothly downward, deep into the earth, and then swoop gracefully back up toward the sky, flawlessly mirroring the exact invisible paths of the celestial bodies as they traverse the immense curved dome of the night. The sheer physical imposing weight of these sweeping stone wings is entirely staggering to comprehend, yet their elegant, perfect mathematical curvature gives them a profound, surprising sense of lightness, as if they are merely resting lightly, delicately upon the courtyard floor, ready at any moment to gently detach themselves from the earth and drift silently upward into the night air, approach the deep, sunken, shadowed bowl of the eastern quadrant, and rest your weary arms softly against the high, smoothly plastered retaining wall. The cool, heavy, cirky plaster feels incredibly soothing against your warm skin, a highly welcome, profoundly grounding sensation in the midst of such dizzying, overwhelming architectural scale. Lean over ever so slightly and look down into the deep, curving, perfectly smooth trench. The interior surface of this massive, sweeping arc is impeccably, flawlessly lined with pristine, pale marble, glowing with an ethereal, milky internal luminescence in the ambient, gathering starlight. Running along the very center of this highly polished, cool marble trough are the intricately, painstakingly engraved scales that quietly measure the slow, silent, unstoppable passage of time. Let us zoom in closer and ever closer, allowing the massive scale of the observatory to fall away until your vision is filled entirely and only with the beautiful, microscopic, perfect details of these ancient, meticulous engravings. The master royal stonemasons did not merely scratch these vital markings casually into the surface. They carved them with a profound, almost spiritual, breathing reverence for absolute, perfect accuracy. Each individual fleeting minute is delineated by a perfectly straight, incredibly fine groove, measuring no wider than a single delicate thread of spun silk. These primary precise grooves are further subdivided into smaller, even finer, almost microscopic increments, allowing the silent, patient observers to measure the smooth flow of time down to an astonishing, razor-thin margin of just 2 seconds. to ensure these incredibly delicate, tiny markings remained perfectly visible in the fading, bruised twilight or under the pale, flickering, warm glow of a paper lantern. The artisans painstakingly, carefully filled each microscopic trench with pure, dark, melted lead. Imagine, for a deeply relaxing moment, the slow, meticulous, hypnotic process of this creation, the careful, quiet melting of the heavy metal over a small, glowing, red-hot charcoal brazier that popped and hissed softly in the night, the delicate, perfectly steady pouring of the thick, liquid lead into the hair-thin, waiting grooves, and the final, exhaustive, rhythmic polishing with a damp cloth and incredibly fine, powdery sand until the dark metal lay perfectly, completely, seamlessly flush with the pale surrounding marble. The astonishing result of this labor is a breathtaking, utterly flawless visual texture, a continuous hypnotic sweeping ribbon of contrasting dark lines set against smooth white stone that curves endlessly, beautifully out of sight into the shadows. As you slowly, gently trace these embedded lead lines with the very sensitive tip of your index finger, you can barely, if at all, feel the physical transition between the two distinct materials, so perfectly and seamlessly have they been married together by ancient hands. The exceptionally smooth, intensely cool stone beneath your fingertips feels incredibly permanent, a solid, unwavering, profoundly comforting anchor in a vast universe defined by constant, sweeping, endless motion. Standing safely and quietly within the deep shadowed embrace of these colossal stone wings, you become acutely aware of a subtle, gentle shift in the nocturnal atmosphere. Because the Brihat Samrat Yantra is so unfathomably massive, it casts an immense, heavy, pooling shadow that acts as a natural, deep reservoir for the descending cool night air. The temperature right here, nestled safely between the sweeping stone quadrants, is noticeably lower, offering a refreshing, perfectly crisp coolness that gently caresses your warm cheeks and settles soothingly, heavily over your tired shoulders like a soft, invisible weighted shawl. This localized, tranquil pocket of cold air carries a slightly different, deeply nuanced scent profile than the open, moonlit courtyard behind you. Here, completely sheltered from the drying, sweeping breezes, the faint, earthy, comforting dampness of the deep, hidden foundation stones mixes seamlessly with a very subtle, almost metallic tang. It is the distant, lingering, evocative aroma of heavy, polished brass and deeply oxidized old bronze, drifting gently over on the faintest current of air from the smaller, intricately geared astrolabes securely mounted on stone pedestals a short distance away. This delicate metallic fragrance is remarkably rich, slightly sweet, and profoundly, deeply historical, smelling of carefully oiled gears, heavy reassuring counterweights, and the silent, patient, smooth friction of perfectly balanced, moving metal parts. It perfectly and harmoniously complements the dry, mineral, dusty scent of the surrounding pink plaster and white marble. You take a long, slow, incredibly deep breath, drawing this complex, deeply tranquil, ancient perfume entirely into the very bottom of your lungs. The air feels dense, completely pure and incredibly clean, completely and utterly devoid of the stifling smoke and thick dust of the bustling, noisy city that lies fast asleep just beyond the high, protective observatory walls. As you slowly, gently exhale, a deep, resonant, heavy sigh automatically escapes your relaxed lips, carrying far away the last stubborn, lingering remnants of wakeful tension from your muscles. You are completely surrounded by massive, silent, heavy monuments dedicated entirely and purely to the patient, unending observation of eternity. There is absolutely no rush, no impending deadline, no urgent, demanding task waiting to be complete. The giant, cool stone wings hold you perfectly safe in their ancient, curving, mathematical embrace, and the towering, magnificent staircase to the stars stands quietly, protectively behind you. A silent, enduring testament to the slow, majestic, and completely peaceful passage of unending, beautiful time. As we gently draw our lingering gaze away from the soaring, majestic heights of the grand sundial, we allow our perfectly unhurried footsteps to carry us further along the smooth, moon-washed paving stones, drifting like a quiet, formless shadow through the silvered night. The path gently curves, winding its way past low, protective walls and sweeping geometrical terraces, leading us toward a profoundly captivating section of the sprawling observatory known as the Jai Prakash Yantra. Translating to the light of the sun, these magnificent instruments are paradoxically just as breathtaking under the quiet, protective veil of the absolute midnight darkness. Approaching the edge of this remarkable installation, the flat, predictable ground suddenly and dramatically gives way to reveal two colossal, perfectly rendered hemispherical bowls sunken deeply into the earth, looking exactly as if two giant, perfectly round celestial spheres had gently fallen from the heavens and pressed their smooth contours into the soft, yielding clay of the courtyard. These twin sunken bowls are a profound testament to the unimaginable patient genius of ancient minds, designed to be exact, flawless, mirrored representations of the vast inverted dome of the night sky above us. Standing at the sweeping, perfectly curved brim of the westernmost bowl, you can look down into its deep, cavernous center, a mesmerizing depression of layered stone and pale plaster that seems to hold its own private pool of heavy, concentrated silence. What makes the Jai Prakash Yantra so utterly fascinating, so entirely hypnotic to the weary, wandering eye, is its remarkably ingenious alternating structure. The master architects realized that to deeply study the inscribed surface of the bowl, an observer would physically need to walk inside it. Thus, they did not build one continuous, solid hemisphere. Instead, they built two complementary bowls, where one bowl features a solid, smooth wedge of gleaming white marble inscribed with delicate astronomical scales. Its twin partner features a deep, empty, sunken pathway in the exact same position. They are perfect photographic negatives of one another, a beautiful physical manifestation of harmony, balance, and the delicate eternal dance between solid matter and empty space. As the pale liquid silver light of the full moon spills evenly over the heavily scalloped rim of the instrument, it creates a breathtaking, deeply rhythmic visual tapestry of alternating light and dark. The solid, sweeping wedges of pale stone catch the moonlight brilliantly, glowing with a soft, chalky, ethereal luminescence, while the sunken, empty pathways are plunged into a thick, velvety, impenetrable blackness, creating a stark, high-contrast, mesmerizing pattern that resembles a giant, sliced fruit made of pure light and shadow. Suspended high above the cavernous, heavy stone bowl, stretching precisely from the northern lip to the southern rim, and from the eastern edge to the western curve, are incredibly fine, impossibly taut crosswires. In the deep, heavy darkness of the midnight hour, these thin, delicate filaments are almost entirely invisible, masquerading perfectly as tiny, unbroken threads of spider silk catching the occasional fleeting glint of ambient starlight. At the exact, perfect mathematical center of these intersecting wires hangs a small circular ring forged of heavy, solid, beautifully oxidized brass. This small, unpretentious ring is the focal point of the entire colossal structure. During the glaring, noisy hours of the day, it casts a tiny, perfectly round, sharp shadow onto the curved marble surfaces far below, acting as the blazing eye of the sun. But now, in the profound, cool stillness of the night, it serves a different, far more peaceful purpose. If you position yourself just right, bending your knees slightly and tilting your weary head, you can align the dark, empty center of that small, suspended brass ring with a single, brightly burning distant star. For a fleeting, profoundly intimate moment, you trap a blazing sun from a distant galaxy perfectly within a tiny hoop of ancient earthly metal, binding the unfathomable, terrifying vastness of the universe to the exact, quiet courtyard where you stand. To truly experience the immersive, encompassing magic of the Jai Prakash, we must slowly, carefully descend into the very earth itself. Let us take the narrow, worn stone stairs that lead gently downward into one of the deep, shadowed, cut-out pathways. With every single deliberate step down into the trench, the ambient temperature of the night air drops remarkably, wrapping around your tired body like a cool, damp, deeply refreshing blanket. The high, smooth walls of the adjacent marble wedges rise up on either side of you, pressing gently but comfortably against your peripheral vision. Walking through these deep, sunken corridors feels exactly like navigating the winding, secret, subterranean canyons of an ancient, forgotten desert city. The stone walls radiating cool, deeply trapped earthly energy provide a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute safety and complete enclosure. You're entirely hidden away from the world up here, completely sheltered from the sweeping winds and entirely cradled in the warm, quiet embrace of the foundational bedrock. The heavy, comforting scent down in this trench is intoxicatingly rich. It is the deep, dark, loamy aroma of untouched earth, the dry, powdery scent of crushed sandstone, and a faint, sweet, lingering whisper of ancient lime plaster that has not seen the direct heat of the sun in centuries. As you walk slowly, dragging your fingertips lightly against the incredibly smooth, cool, polished marble walls rising to your left and right, you can feel the tiny, perfectly straight, lead-filled engravings passing beneath your sensitive skin. These are the zenith distances, the exact altitudes, and the precise azimuths of the sweeping heavens, carefully translated into a tangible, physical language of stone and metal that a blindfolded man could read simply by touch. The friction of your slow-moving hand makes virtually no sound, only a faint, dry, whispering swish that is instantly swallowed up by the heavy, damp acoustics of the sunken trench. Stop for a moment in the very deepest part of the curving pathway, directly beneath the central suspended brass ring. Lean the heavy weight of your back against the cool supporting curve of the masonry wall, tilt your head back and look straight up. From this deeply recessed, hidden vantage point, the walls of the Jai Prakash completely block out all surrounding monuments, all distant trees, and all the low, flickering, warm lamps of the distant city walls. Your entire field of vision is perfectly, flawlessly restricted to the pure, untainted vast circle of the nocturnal sky framed by the scalloped dark rim of the hemisphere above. Down here, the absolute stillness is so potent, so deeply concentrated, that it becomes almost a physical substance, a heavy, warm liquid that fills your ears and completely slows the frantic racing beating of your heart. The soft nocturnal wind that murmurs over the top of the bowl does not reach down into this protected, sunken sanctuary. Instead, it merely skims gracefully over the surface, occasionally catching the taut, suspended crosswires and making them vibrate with an impossibly low, deeply resonant, thrumming frequency. It is a sound that rests completely at the absolute edge of human perception, feeling more like a slow, rhythmic, soothing vibration settling deeply into your chest bones than an actual audible noise. It is the slow, steady heartbeat of the Jantar Mantar, a gentle, hypnotic pulse that perfectly syncs with the slow, deep, relaxing rhythm of your own breathing. Staring up at the framed, circular canvas of glittering silver stars, separated entirely from the sprawling earth around you, the immense, tiring weight of the present moment simply dissolves. There is no past, and there is absolutely no future to worry over. There is only this silent, deeply comfortable, sunken stone cradle, the cool, fragrant air washing over your face, and the impossibly slow, deeply majestic turning of the celestial sphere continuing its endless, peaceful rotation above your resting, heavy eyes. Moving onwards, drifting like a quiet, untroubled, formless shadow through the beautifully silvered night, we gently ascend from the sunken, earthy embrace of the hemispherical bowls and approach the striking, incredibly imposing vertical forms of the Ram Yantra, rising dramatically from a wide, perfectly flat, smoothly plastered plinth. These twin, colossal, cylindrical structures cast impossibly long, deeply curved shadows across the courtyard floor, looking under the pale moonlight like the crumbling, majestic, hollowed-out towers of a deeply forgotten ancient fortress. Unlike the sweeping, grounded arcs of the grand sundials or the deeply sunken protective bowls we just left behind, the Ram Yantra reaches decisively and proudly upwards, commanding the vertical space with a ring of towering, perfectly spaced stone pillars. These vertical columns form a magnificent circular palisade, a crown of heavy masonry that attempts to reach out and capture the very zenith of the night sky itself. In the muted, washing, silvery light of the late hour, the external surfaces of these giant cylinders reveal their beautiful, deeply textured nature. They are constructed of thick, rough-hewn blocks of local Rajasthani red sandstone, a dense, ancient, deeply geological material that holds the fierce, fiery memory of the desert within its very core. Let us step closer, moving our quiet, unhurried feet over the smooth stone pathway until we are standing just inches from the heavily textured, towering outer wall. Under the glare of the daytime sun, this sandstone burns with a vivid, aggressive, rusty crimson hue, but now bathed entirely in the cool, forgiving, pale luminescence of the midnight moon. The intense colour is wonderfully softened, transformed into a deep, beautifully bruised plum or a rich, dusty ash rose. If you press the flat, warm palm of your hand flat against the side of one of these massive, towering pillars, you can feel the incredible granular roughness of the ancient stone. It is deeply pitted and heavily scarred by 3 centuries of abrasive desert winds, driving monsoon rains and the slow, inevitable grinding passage of time. Yet beneath that rough, deeply weathered exterior, the stone remains incredibly dense, perfectly solid, and wonderfully cool to the touch. Embedded deep within the matrix of the red sandstone are millions upon millions of microscopic, perfectly sharp flecks of pure crystalline quartz. Usually invisible to the naked eye, these tiny hidden crystals occasionally perfectly catch the direct light of the moon, causing the massive dark pillar to twinkle faintly and subtly, as if the heavy stone itself were sparsely dusted with crushed diamonds or fallen frozen stars. We do not merely admire the Ram Yantra from the outside, we are gently, silently invited to step within its profound, towering enclosure. Passing slowly through one of the narrow, vertical, deeply shadowed gaps between the heavy masonry walls, we cross an invisible atmospheric threshold and step into the very center of the colossal cylinder. Instantly, the vast, sprawling, open expanse of the surrounding courtyard disappears, entirely replaced by a beautifully tight, deeply intimate and highly focused vertical space. The interior walls of the towering columns are perfectly, flawlessly plastered and painted a pristine, ghostly white, creating a stark, breathtaking visual contrast with the rough, dark red sandstone of the exterior. The floor beneath our feet is not a flat, simple plane, but an intricate, beautifully complex and sweeping mosaic of raised stone wedges and deep, empty voids, radiating perfectly outward from the center, like the sprawling petals of a giant, geometric stone lotus flower. This alternating, deeply rhythmic pattern of solid walkways and empty, sunken space requires a slow, intensely deliberate, and deeply mindful manner of walking, forcing you to pay utter, complete attention to the exact placement of your feet, drawing your racing mind entirely away from its worries, and firmly, safely anchoring it in the present, deeply quiet moment. Rising proudly and steadfastly from the absolute mathematically flawless geometric center of this circular space is a single, remarkably thick monumental pillar. It stretches upwards like a giant pale stone finger pointing in silent, eternal reverence toward the zenith of the heavens. This central column is the anchor, the unwavering reference point from which all the vast, sweeping distances of the stars are meticulously measured. As you step carefully onto one of the raised, pie-shaped stone wedges and walk slowly, deliberately toward the center, the heavy, enclosing cylindrical walls perfectly and entirely dampen the already quiet sounds of the midnight courtyard. The faint, distant rustle of the peepal tree leaves is completely cut off. The subtle, low hum of the wind across the grand sundials is silenced entirely. Here, inside the deep sheltering belly of the Ram Yantra, the acoustic isolation is absolute, profound, and deeply, overwhelmingly peaceful. The silence inside this stone ring is so pure, so incredibly heavy and unbroken, that you can actually hear the soft, rhythmic rustle of your own cotton clothing as you move, the slow, reassuring rush of air entering and gently leaving your lungs, and the deep, steady, comforting thrum of your own resting heartbeat echoing faintly, softly against the curved, plastered walls. The air trapped within this towering cylinder has its own distinct, deeply nuanced and comforting scent. It lacks the dry, dusty openness of the main pathways. Instead, it carries the faint, incredibly subtle, deeply soothing aroma of old trapped rain. It is the distinct, mineral-rich smell of damp, porous rock, the deeply comforting fragrance of cool, sheltered stone that slowly, patiently absorbs the evening dew and holds it safely within its dark, heavy core until the morning. Let this clean, ancient, beautifully heavy scent fill your senses entirely as you lean your tired back gently against the cool, incredibly solid, smooth surface of the central pillar. The stone feels wonderfully supportive, completely unyielding, and incredibly strong, easily taking the full, heavy weight of your relaxed body. With your head resting backward against the cool masonry, you turn your gaze upwards directly up the towering pale length of the pillar, past the sweeping beautifully shadowed arches of the inner walls, and out through the massive, perfectly circular open roof. From this unique, deeply grounded perspective, the entire vast universe is instantly distilled, perfectly framed, and entirely contained within a single perfect unbroken ring of solid masonry. The high walls completely cut off the confusing, cluttered horizon, stripping away everything earthly and leaving only a pure, vast, circular portrait of the nocturnal cosmos. The velvet blackness of the sky seems infinitely deep, a bottomless, sweeping ocean of dark matter, completely dusted with perfectly brilliant, unblinking silver light. Because your frame of reference is entirely fixed by the perfectly still, incredibly solid, ancient stone walls towering perfectly around you, the slow, magnificent, endless turning of the earth becomes deeply physically apparent. If you focus your tired, heavy eyes on a single brightly burning star positioned right near the very edge of the stone rim, and simply wait in the warm, perfect silence, you will slowly, inevitably see it drift. It inches with profound, majestic slowness behind the solid masonry, swallowed gently by the stone while another, new glittering point of light slowly, gracefully emerges from the opposite side. It is a deeply hypnotic, incredibly soothing realization, watching the great silent wheel of the heavens turn endlessly above your safe, completely sheltered and utterly peaceful sanctuary, pulling you gently, effortlessly, and deeper into a state of total, heavy, perfect relaxation. As we gently step out from the deep, resonant, and heavy silence of the cylindrical Ram Yantra, our slow, unhurried path leads us further across the sprawling, moonlit courtyard toward a breathtaking, beautifully complex cluster of architectural wonders known as the Rashavalaya Yantra. Unlike the massive, singular, dominating structures we have encountered thus far, this specific, enchanting installation is a harmonious, quiet congregation of exactly 12 distinct, perfectly calculated stone pavilions. Each of these 12 elegant structures represents one of the ancient zodiac constellations, meticulously angled, purposefully tilted, and flawlessly oriented to capture the exact, sweeping celestial path of its corresponding star group as it reaches its absolute highest point in the velvet night sky. In the pale, washing, liquid silver light of the Jantar Mantar's midnight hour, these 12 pavilions appear exactly like a silent, frozen architectural ballet, a profound, majestic gathering of stone sentinels leaning gracefully in 12 different, precise directions, as if they are all quietly, patiently listening to separate, whispered secrets falling from the glittering heavens above. The deeply rhythmic, sweeping arrangement of these angled walls and sloping staircases creates a mesmerizing, perfectly disjointed maze of deep, pooling shadow and brilliant, chalky white moonlight, inviting the weary, wandering mind to gently lose itself in the beautiful, complex mathematical poetry of their arrangement. Let us slowly approach one of these 12 silent watchers, allowing the gentle, incredibly soft night breeze to guide our steps through the labyrinth of perfectly angled stone. We find ourselves standing before the pavilion dedicated to the constellation of Rishabha, the celestial bull, because its corresponding stars follow a very specific, deeply curved trajectory across the nocturnal dome. The massive central gnomon of this particular instrument is tilted at a surprisingly sharp, dramatic angle, leaning heavily backward into the quiet night, as if reclining comfortably against an invisible, massive pillow of cool air. To walk up to this structure is to experience a profound, deeply disorienting, yet incredibly soothing visual illusion. The strict, rigid rules of earthly gravity seem to subtly, beautifully bend and soften here, completely superseded by the higher, more perfect laws of celestial geometry. The heavy masonry does not feel burdened by its own immense weight. Instead, the steep, sweeping incline of the plastered walls gives it a sweeping, dynamic sense of pure upward lift, as if the entire heavy monument is caught in a state of suspended, graceful levitation, waiting patiently for a single final gust of starlight to carry it completely away into the dark, welcoming cosmos. Run your sensitive, warm fingertips slowly along the sloping, angular edge of the Vrishabha Pavilion's central dividing wall. Here the meticulously applied Circe plaster feels remarkably, distinctively different from the vast open surfaces of the supreme sundial. Because these 12 zodiac structures are slightly smaller and significantly more sheltered by their close proximity to one another, their perfectly polished surfaces have been beautifully protected from the harshest, most abrasive, driving winds of the open desert plain. Consequently, the plaster here retains an even more astonishing glass-like smoothness, possessing the dense, heavy, pearlescent texture of a deeply polished ancient seashell or a flawlessly carved piece of cold, heavy jade. When the pure, unadulterated moonlight strikes the flat, sweeping face of this inclined wall, it does not merely illuminate the stone. The pale light actually seems to sink a few millimeters deep into the slightly translucent surface of the pristine lime and crushed terracotta, causing the entire massive structure to glow softly, beautifully from within. It is a warm, deeply comforting and ghostly luminescence that gently illuminates the surrounding heavy shadows, casting a remarkably soft, flattering and peaceful pallor over the entire quiet courtyard, softening every sharp edge and gently blurring the harsh, rigid boundaries between the heavy earth and the vast, empty air. We slowly climb the short, perfectly proportioned, incredibly narrow flight of worn stone stairs that runs perfectly parallel to the leaning, deeply angled gnomon. The smooth, concave depressions in these specific, quiet steps are slightly shallower, indicating that they were traversed only during the exact fleeting months when this specific constellation ruled the midnight sky. Find a comfortable, completely sheltered spot near the very top of the sweeping, inclined wall and gently lower yourself down onto the cool, solid stone. Lean your tired back against the perfectly smooth, heavily plastered masonry, allowing your spine to easily, comfortably adopt the precise mathematical angle of the ancient instrument. By simply resting your heavy, weary body against this meticulously tilted surface, your gaze is instantly, effortlessly, and flawlessly directed toward the exact, perfect quadrant of the vast night sky where the glittering, ancient stars of the Vrishabha constellation slowly, majestically drift. You do not have to strain your neck, you do not have to actively search the sprawling heavens. The ancient, heavy stone structure lovingly, perfectly cradles your tired form, physically guiding your weary eyes toward the exact, beautiful, celestial spectacle it was permanently built to observe, creating a profound, deeply touching harmony between the resting, vulnerable human body and the sweeping, vast architecture of the cosmos. Sitting quietly here, suspended gracefully between the heavy, sleeping earth and the slowly turning, glittering stars, you become intimately, acutely aware of the delicate, microscopic symphony of the deeply settled night. The 12 clustered pavilions of the Ram Yantra inadvertently act as a giant, beautiful acoustic funnel, gently capturing and beautifully amplifying the tiniest, most imperceptible murmurs of the desert breeze. As the cool air slowly winds its way through the narrow angled gaps between the 12 leaning structures, it produces a faint, continuous, deeply melodic whispering sound, exactly like the soft, rhythmic exhales of a dozen sleeping giants. Accompanying this gentle, sweeping architectural breath is the impossibly faint, rhythmic, deeply soothing chirp of a solitary hidden cricket, safely nestled somewhere deep within the dry, fragrant, pale yellow grass that grows stubbornly at the very base of the outer perimeter walls. The insect's slow, deliberate, incredibly sleepy song perfectly, beautifully matches the unhurried, majestic pacing of the night, a tiny, organic, living heartbeat pulsing softly, steadily against the vast, cold, indifferent, and sweeping eternity of the slowly turning stars. The deep, heavy, intoxicating scent of crushed, dry sand, cool, dense plaster, and ancient oxidized lead completely envelops you, wrapping your mind in a thick, beautifully soft cocoon of perfect historical safety, allowing your heavy eyelids to flutter, dip, and slowly, gently close for a long, deeply peaceful moment of absolute, unwavering rest. While the sweeping, colossal stone instruments of the Jantar Mantar perfectly capture the cold, majestic, and absolute perfection of the distant cosmos, This vast, silent observatory is also a place deeply, intimately touched by the soft, warm, tanned, profoundly human rhythms of the ancient men who devoted their quiet lives to tending it. Let us gently draw our gaze away from the towering pale masonry and the sweeping abstract geometry of the zodiac pavilions, and softly direct our attention toward the heavy, deeply shadowed perimeter walls that enclose the sacred, quiet compound. Nestled safely and inconspicuously within the thick, impenetrable base of these massive protective walls are several small, perfectly arched, deeply recessed stone alcoves. These beautifully intimate, human-scaled spaces were thoughtfully designed to provide essential, warm shelter for the royal astronomers during their incredibly long, solitary, and deeply silent nocturnal vigils. As we slowly, quietly drift toward one of these recessed, dark alcoves, a faint, remarkably warm and deeply comforting glow gently spills out onto the cool, pale paving stones, offering a beautiful, striking amber contrast to the cold, liquid silver washing over the rest of the open courtyard. Stepping carefully and silently into the soft, welcoming embrace of the arched stone alcove, the ambient physical temperature of the air undergoes a sudden, highly comforting, and beautiful transformation. The thick, massive red sandstone walls of the deep recess perfectly absorb and tightly hold the lingering, deeply pleasant warmth of a small, glowing brass brazier resting quietly on the floor. This beautiful, intricately hammered, heavy brass vessel is filled with a shallow bed of perfectly grey, completely soft, powdery ash, hiding just a few tiny, glowing, deeply red embers of slowly burning, fragrant acacia wood. The heat radiating from this tiny, contained fire is not aggressive or harsh. Rather, it is a remarkably gentle, deeply soothing, and perfectly steady wave of deep warmth that instantly beautifully thaws the slight, creeping chill of the desert midnight from your tired bones. Covering the cold, hard, unyielding stone floor of the alcove is a beautifully thick, incredibly heavy, deeply worn wool rug, woven by skilled patient hands in the distant mountainous north. The deep, rich, saturated indigo and heavily faded crimson dyes of the dense wool have been remarkably softened by decades of use, and the thick plush pile of the fabric provides a beautifully soft, yielding and profoundly comfortable surface upon which the weary, silent sky watchers would rest their tired, aching limbs during the longest, darkest, quietest hours of the slow-turning night. Sitting quietly on this thick, beautiful rug is an intricately carved, heavily oiled, dark teakwood tray, holding the incredibly simple, deeply comforting, and highly sensory tools of the astronomer's midnight routine, beside a small, heavily shielded brass oil lamp, whose tiny, flickering golden flame dances beautifully and softly behind a protective screen of incredibly thin, translucent animal horn, sits a smooth, heavy, deeply polished mortar and pestle made of cool, dark, dense soapstone. If you listen very closely, tuning your tired ears perfectly to the tiny, beautiful acoustics of the small stone room, you can almost clearly hear the lingering, rhythmic, deeply soothing echoes of the gentle, repetitive grinding that took place here just an hour before. The royal astronomer, swathed tightly in incredibly thick, heavy, beautifully soft woolen shawls to ward off the creeping dampness of the dew, would slowly, methodically crush a single, highly fragrant pod of green cardamom, a tiny, rough shard of warm, spicy nutmeg, and a few incredibly delicate, microscopic threads of pure, deep red saffron. The resulting scent that perfectly, beautifully saturates the still, warm air of the alcove is absolutely intoxicating. It is an incredibly rich, deeply complex, beautifully sweet, and profoundly earthy aroma that speaks vividly of distant, lush spice markets, slow, careful preparation, and the deep, profound comfort of ancient, deeply soothing, nocturnal traditions. This beautifully fragrant, freshly ground spice mixture would then be carefully, gently swept into a small, heavily dented, incredibly beautiful, deep copper pot filled with rich, fatty, fresh buffalo milk. The pot, resting softly on a tiny, separate iron stand just inches above the glowing red acacia embers, would slowly, perfectly come to a gentle, rolling simmer. Imagine the incredibly soft, deeply rhythmic, wet, bubbling sound of the warming milk, a deeply hypnotic, beautifully gentle sh-pop, sh-pop, pop that fills the small arched space with a profoundly comforting, heavy and deeply domestic auditory warmth. The astronomer would then slowly, carefully pour this steaming, beautifully fragrant, golden-tinted liquid into a perfectly simple, unglazed, highly textured cup made of baked terracotta clay, known to the locals as a kolhad. When the incredibly hot, perfectly spiced milk gently touches the porous, unsealed interior of the dry earthen cup, it produces a profoundly beautiful, entirely unique, and deeply evocative scent. It is the exact beautiful smell of the first heavy drops of warm monsoon rain striking the parched, baking desert earth, a scent deeply known as petrichor, perfectly, beautifully mingling with the sweet, heavy, rich fragrance of the saffron and the sharp, warm, deeply comforting bite of the crushed cardamom. Holding this heavy, warm, beautifully textured clay cup in two resting, cold hands provides an incredibly grounding, deeply tactile, and beautifully sensory anchor in the midst of the vast, sweeping intellectual pursuit of tracking the infinite cosmos. The slightly rough, intensely earthy texture of the baked clay, perfectly warmed by the heavily spiced milk within, sends a deeply comforting, perfectly steady pulse of physical warmth traveling slowly, beautifully up through the wrists, gently relaxing the tight, aching muscles of the arms, and settling deeply, permanently into the chest. Between incredibly long, silent, perfectly focused observations at the towering cold stone instruments, the astronomer would retreat to this beautifully warm, deeply scented, perfectly sheltered sanctuary. He would slowly, carefully sip the intensely sweet, heavy, deeply comforting liquid, allowing the warm, beautiful spices to gently soothe his tired throat and perfectly sharpen his wandering, sleepy mind. As the hot, golden milk slowly diminishes in the rough clay cup, he would unroll an incredibly soft, beautifully supple, highly worn piece of pale parchment upon his knees, the incredibly faint, scratching sound of his deeply focused quill softly recording the exact, beautiful, sweeping positions of the silent stars, creating a permanent, incredibly delicate paper memory of this perfectly peaceful, completely unhurried, and deeply beautiful moment in the vast, slow river of deep time. As the quiet, deeply devoted astronomer sits entirely enveloped within the protective, heavy stone embrace of his warmly lit alcove, his physical presence is a profound, beautiful continuation of the slow, methodical, and deeply textured nature of the surrounding observatory. Every single garment he wears, every meticulously crafted tool he touches, carries its own sweeping, intricate history, beautifully echoing the vast, patient dedication required to map the infinite, turning heavens. Let us gently lower our gaze from the towering, pale geometry of the distant Jantar Mantar walls and slowly zoom our focus onto the profoundly tactile, incredibly soft and deeply comforting fabrics that gracefully drape across his resting, weary shoulders, providing an essential, warm barrier against the creeping silver chill of the long desert midnight. The primary garment resting beautifully against his skin is a long, sweeping, incredibly heavy cotton tunic, traditionally known as an angaka, which gently wraps and securely ties across his chest. This magnificent piece of clothing is not mass-produced, but entirely, painstakingly hand-spun and beautifully hand-woven on a large, heavy wooden loom. If you were to gently run your resting hand over the surface of this unbleached, thick fabric, you would instantly feel the beautiful, irregular, and perfectly organic slubs of the raw cotton fibers, a deeply grounding, perfectly imperfect texture that warmly speaks of ancient, rhythmic human labor. The heavy cotton of the angaka carries an incredibly subtle, deeply comforting scent profile, an earthy, beautiful mixture that perfectly complements the surrounding stone and spice. It is the faint, dry, deeply evocative aroma of the raw, sun-baked cotton bowls resting lightly in woven bamboo baskets, beautifully mingled with the deeply clean, perfectly natural smell of starch derived from crushed rice water, a traditional method used to give the thick fabric its crisp, beautifully protective structure over this heavy cotton foundation to perfectly ward off the deeply descending dew that gently settles upon the cold marble of the courtyard. The astronomer is tightly wrapped in an incredibly wide, wonderfully soft and profoundly thick woolen shawl. This extraordinary blanket is woven from the deeply prized, incredibly fine undercoat of mountain goats that graze slowly and peacefully in the far, freezing, snow-capped peaks of the distant Himalayas. The painstaking journey of this deeply warm wool, from the towering icy ridges down to this quiet desert courtyard, is a beautifully long, slow story woven entirely into the very warp and weft of the magnificent fabric. The dense, heavy shawl has been carefully, lovingly dyed using only perfectly natural, deeply organic materials, achieving a profound, intensely rich shade of muted bruised plum by meticulously boiling massive iron vats of crushed, dried walnut shells and deeply fragrant, dark pomegranate rinds. When the astronomer gently, slowly adjusts the heavy, perfectly draping folds of this beautiful woolen shawl around his neck and shoulders, the incredibly soft, deeply plush fibers silently trap the ambient, rising warmth from the glowing acacia embers resting quietly in the nearby brass brazier. The wool still faintly, beautifully retains the incredibly soothing, deeply earthy scent of natural lanolin, an organic, sweet, and perfectly grounding aroma that instantly brings to the weary mind incredibly peaceful images of quiet, safely enclosed pastures and perfectly untroubled, deeply sleeping flocks. Covering his tired, slowly pacing feet are a pair of beautifully simple, incredibly soft, perfectly broken-in slippers, expertly crafted from incredibly supple, heavily oiled camel leather. The extremely fine, beautifully delicate dark stitching along the gracefully curving, completely rounded toes of these soft shoes is an absolute masterpiece of quiet, dedicated craftsmanship. The deeply worn, completely smooth leather soles are specifically intentionally designed to allow the astronomer to walk silently, almost entirely like a drifting, weightless phantom across the sprawling cold stone courtyard. They provide the absolute, perfectly flawless traction needed to gently climb the incredibly steep, narrow, soaring staircases of the giant sundials without making a single jarring sound that might unexpectedly shatter the profound oceanic silence of the deeply resting night. Resting quietly, perfectly balanced upon his heavily draped warm knees is the thick, deeply textured, incredibly beautiful piece of ancient parchment upon which he slowly, painstakingly records his vital, sweeping celestial observations. This magnificent paper is entirely handmade, carefully crafted from a thoroughly pounded, beautifully wet mixture of deeply soaked rough hemp fibers and incredibly soft recycled cotton rags. The deeply skilled papermakers would meticulously dip heavy, rectangular wooden frames lined with incredibly fine, perfectly straight bamboo screens into vast, slow-moving vats of this beautifully thick, cloudy pulp, gently lifting and perfectly shaking the frame to beautifully align the microscopic fibers. After being carefully, slowly pressed under immense, heavy, flat stones to perfectly squeeze out every last single drop of excess water, the deeply textured sheets were laid out gently and peacefully in the sweeping, deeply shaded groves to perfectly, slowly dry in the warm, gentle breezes. To achieve the absolute flawless smoothness strictly required for incredibly precise, microscopic astronomical notations, the thoroughly dried paper was then laid upon a beautifully curved, completely smooth piece of heavy hardwood and polished endlessly, rhythmically, and deeply patiently, with a highly rounded, incredibly cool piece of solid agate stone. The resulting surface is beautifully, remarkably soft to the touch, possessing the incredibly faint, beautifully subtle sweeping grain of a finely sliced piece of heavy ivory. Beside his perfectly resting, deeply focused hand sits his small, incredibly heavy, beautifully unadorned inkwell, perfectly carved from a single heavy block of dense dark green soapstone. The ink contained deep within this tiny, beautifully heavy vessel is not purchased, but entirely, painstakingly made by the astronomer himself, following incredibly old, perfectly guarded, deeply chemical traditions. To perfectly create this profoundly dark, incredibly permanent liquid, he slowly, carefully burns pure, highly pressed mustard oil in a tiny, perfectly simple clay lamp, gently and purposefully capturing the deeply black, beautifully powdery soot that slowly rises and thickly coats the inside of a suspended, deeply cold, heavy copper dome. This incredibly fine, deeply black carbon is then meticulously, completely scraped away and perfectly, heavily ground into an incredibly fine, incredibly smooth, deeply dark powder. Sitting peacefully in the quiet, warm alcove, he carefully, slowly adds tiny, perfect drops of deeply clear, meticulously distilled rainwater, beautifully combined with a deeply sticky, incredibly fragrant, highly viscous sap gathered entirely from the rough, deeply scarred bark of the hardy acacia tree. The deeply resonant, incredibly hypnotic, completely repetitive sound of his perfectly smooth soapstone pestle slowly, rhythmically grinding this heavy, dark mixture against the curved, perfectly smooth sides of the heavy inkwell is a profoundly soothing, incredibly beautiful lullaby for the tired, racing mind. It is a deeply slow, perfectly consistent, intensely wet and deeply grinding sound. A soft, beautiful shkur, shkur, shkur that deeply, perfectly harmonizes with the incredibly faint, beautifully distant, deeply whispering rustle of the dry desert wind outside the heavy stone walls. The deeply intoxicating, perfectly clean, incredibly sharp scent of the fresh, dark ink is an absolutely beautiful, profoundly evocative mixture of incredibly deep, earthy carbon soot, deeply clean, fresh rainwater, and the slightly sweet, incredibly rich, perfectly amber fragrance of the heavy tree resin. Taking his perfectly carved, deeply smooth, incredibly light reed pen, carefully and beautifully cut to a highly precise, perfectly angled, incredibly sharp nib, using a small, incredibly heavy, deeply polished iron knife, he slowly, gracefully dips it into the profoundly dark, beautifully thick ink. As the incredibly sharp, perfectly wet tip of the reed deeply, softly meets the completely smooth, beautifully fibrous surface of the heavy handmade paper, it produces a deeply faint, incredibly soothing, perfectly rhythmic, beautifully scratching sound. It is the absolutely quiet, profoundly gentle, deeply enduring sound of slowly unfolding history being permanently, beautifully etched into the deep, physical reality of the peaceful, safely sleeping world. As the astronomer finishes his incredibly precise, beautifully delicate ink notations, gently laying the perfectly carved reed pen back onto the deeply polished, wonderfully heavy dark teakwood tray, his calm, incredibly restful eyes shift slowly away from the beautifully inscribed paper and settle quietly upon another deeply fascinating, profoundly rhythmic instrument resting softly in the corner of his warmly lit, deeply sheltered alcove. While the massive, towering stone architecture of the sweeping Jantar Mantar is flawlessly designed to carefully measure the majestic, incredibly slow, sweeping movement of the heavens over the course of deeply long, turning hours, there exists a profound, beautiful need to precisely track the incredibly small, beautifully fleeting, quietly passing moments of the deeply silent night. For this essential, deeply patient task, the deeply devoted sky watchers do not rely on sweeping shadows cast by heavy stone, but instead turn to the gentle, incredibly soothing, perfectly fluid and beautifully hypnotic properties of slowly moving water. Resting quietly upon a beautifully carved, perfectly square, incredibly heavy block of pale, perfectly smooth marble is a truly magnificent, profoundly complex, and deeply ancient timekeeping device, universally known throughout the quiet, historical subcontinent as the deeply revered Ghatika Yantra, or the traditional, deeply soothing water clock. The primary, magnificent foundation of this beautifully complex, profoundly simple instrument is a surprisingly large, incredibly heavy, perfectly circular, deeply deep basin entirely forged from solid, incredibly thick, beautiful copper. This massive, heavy vessel was painstakingly, perfectly crafted by deeply skilled, incredibly patient coppersmiths in the bustling, deeply vibrant, slowly sleeping markets of the lower city. If you perfectly closely examine the deeply curving, incredibly beautiful outer surface of this magnificent, incredibly heavy copper basin, you can easily clearly see the thousands upon thousands of tiny, perfectly overlapping, beautifully rhythmic, highly shallow dimples permanently left behind by the perfectly rounded, heavy head of the artisan's deeply swinging, heavily weighted hammer. These countless beautifully small, deeply repetitive indentations beautifully catch the warm, incredibly soft, deeply amber glow from the nearby gently resting charcoal brazier, creating a highly mesmerizing, incredibly hypnotic, completely stunning pattern of warm, deeply shifting light and incredibly small, perfectly dark, deeply pooling shadows that slowly, beautifully ripple across the incredibly heavy metal surface like perfectly captured, completely frozen, beautifully still waves on a dark, perfectly quiet copper ocean. The beautifully wide, incredibly heavy copper basin is perfectly, completely filled with entirely clear, deeply cold, perfectly pristine water, painstakingly, carefully drawn just before the bruised, sweeping twilight from a deeply sunken, incredibly ancient, heavily shadowed, remarkably quiet stone stepwell located just safely outside the high, heavy, deeply protective walls of the observatory complex. Because this magnificent, heavily grounded water has spent countless, deeply silent, incredibly long centuries, completely filtered through massive, incredibly dense, heavily compressed layers of subterranean sandstone, and deeply hidden, completely untouched limestone aquifers, possesses a profoundly deep, incredibly rich, completely heavy mineral scent. It is a beautifully earthy, profoundly grounding, intensely clean, perfectly pure fragrance that softly, beautifully mingles with the incredibly dry, perfectly baked, heavy desert air, creating a profoundly soothing, incredibly refreshing, deeply delicate microclimate of perfect, absolute tranquility, perfectly contained within the heavy, deeply secure walls of the warm, shadowed alcove. The surface of this deeply contained, completely sheltered water is absolutely, entirely, flawlessly still, acting as a magnificent, perfectly dark, incredibly clear, completely flawless mirror that perfectly beautifully reflects the pale, washing, deeply ethereal silver light of the slowly drifting, deeply distant full moon. Floating perfectly, beautifully, completely weightlessly, in the exact, perfectly mathematical, highly precise center of this dark, heavy pool of cold, pure water is a much smaller, incredibly delicate, remarkably thin, deeply beautiful, perfectly hemispherical bowl, meticulously crafted from highly polished, incredibly bright, heavily oxidized brass. This deeply beautiful, perfectly golden floating vessel is the exact, true heart of the magnificent Ghatika Yantra. In the absolute, perfectly flawless, incredibly smooth, geometric center of the heavily curved, highly polished bottom of this thin brass bowl, the master, deeply patient jeweler has completely, carefully pierced a single, incredibly microscopic, perfectly round hole, measuring no wider than a single, deeply delicate, incredibly fine strand of heavily spun, deeply beautiful silk. As the completely empty, heavily buoyant, perfectly dry brass bowl sits quietly, resting beautifully upon the heavily taut, perfectly unbroken surface tension of the cool, dark water, a deeply fascinating, incredibly hypnotic, perfectly inevitable, profoundly slow physical process quietly, gently, beautifully begins to carefully, silently unfold right before your deeply heavy, completely resting, utterly relaxed eyes. Very slowly, with agonizing, perfectly beautiful, incredibly hypnotic, utterly peaceful deliberation, the deeply cold, highly pressurized water from the heavy, dark copper basin completely, gently, silently begins to push its way upward through the microscopic, completely perfect, heavily pierced aperture located exactly in the bottom of the floating, incredibly bright brass bowl. If you lean in incredibly close, gently lowering your deeply tired, completely resting ear perfectly near the highly polished, beautifully heavy rim of the massive copper basin, you can clearly, perfectly hear the incredibly faint, deeply delicate, beautifully musical, highly rhythmic sound of the cold, heavy water slowly, gently entering the dry, empty space. It is a profoundly quiet, incredibly small, absolutely delicate, beautifully wet sip, 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 a sound so completely microscopic, so entirely fragile, so deeply intimate, that it immediately, perfectly, completely commands your absolute, entirely undivided, deeply peaceful attention. With every single entirely tiny, incredibly fragile, beautifully slow droplet that perfectly breaches the microscopic, highly precise hole, the incredibly delicate, remarkably thin brass bowl grows infinitesimally, perfectly, beautifully heavier, settling incredibly slowly, completely evenly, perfectly deeply into the dark, incredibly cool, perfectly still, beautifully resting embrace of the surrounding heavy water. For a deeply long, completely uninterrupted, entirely peaceful span of exactly 24 incredibly slow, highly exact, perfectly flowing minutes, a deeply precise period of ancient, perfectly measured time known beautifully as a single Gati, the royal astronomer sits in absolutely perfect, deeply unwavering, heavily silent, completely peaceful contemplation, watching the bright, highly polished brass bowl slowly, beautifully, perfectly, inevitably fill with the cool, deeply heavy, absolutely clear, perfectly dark water. The incredibly slow, completely gradual, perfectly beautiful sinking of the bright golden hemisphere is deeply, profoundly, entirely hypnotic, a totally quiet, deeply visible, absolutely physical, completely beautiful representation of passing, gentle, perfectly harmless time. As the cold, heavy water level finally, beautifully, completely reaches the absolute, incredibly thin, highly polished lip of the heavy brass rim, there is a single, deeply breathtaking, entirely beautiful, completely silent, incredibly slow moment of perfect, absolute suspense. And then, beautifully, incredibly softly, without any jarring, shocking, or completely violent motion, the incredibly thin, totally beautiful brass bowl completely perfectly surrenders to the incredible heavy weight of the deeply cold water, slipping gracefully, perfectly, beautifully beneath the dark, heavily still surface with a deeply soft, highly resonant, entirely beautiful, remarkably delicate, completely liquid plink. As the bright, heavily submerged brass bowl slowly, beautifully, perfectly gently sinks completely to the perfectly dark, incredibly hard, heavily oxidized bottom of the deeply heavy copper basin, perfectly creating a set of incredibly gentle, highly small, completely beautiful, completely concentric ripples that softly, entirely silently lap against the heavy, deeply cool metal edges, the perfectly attentive, deeply quiet astronomer gently, slowly reaches out his resting, warm hand. He carefully, softly, beautifully lifts a incredibly small, highly rounded, completely wooden mallet, perfectly, entirely wrapped in a deeply thick, incredibly soft, beautifully beautiful layer of deeply heavy, tightly woven felt. With a single, entirely unhurried, perfectly graceful, incredibly gentle motion, he softly, beautifully strikes a highly polished, incredibly heavy, completely thick, deeply flat brass gong resting perfectly beside the water clock. The deeply soft, incredibly muffled, completely heavy, highly resonant, profoundly beautiful sound perfectly, beautifully blossoms into the incredibly quiet, completely still, heavily resting midnight air. It is a completely low, incredibly deep, totally sweeping, absolutely soothing, entirely heavy thum that beautifully, perfectly vibrates deeply, warmly through the completely smooth, heavily paved stone floor, perfectly quietly rolling across the entire, deeply sleeping, completely shadowed, completely magnificent observatory, beautifully, perfectly announcing the incredibly gentle, completely peaceful, deeply perfect passing of another perfectly slow, absolutely beautiful, completely harmonious segment of ancient, resting, deeply sweeping time. As the resonant, muffled echo of the struck brass gong dissolves softly into the velvet canopy of the midnight air, we gently step out from the warm, sheltered sanctuary of the stone alcove. We move with unhurried, silent footsteps across the cool, pale paving stones, our quiet path bathed entirely in the soft washing light of the descending moon. Leaving behind the massive, towering masonry structures that dominate the center of the sprawling complex, we approach an entirely different, intimately scaled corner of the observatory. Here, suspended heavily within a massive frame of deeply aged teakwood, hangs the magnificent Yantra Raj, the revered king of instruments. Unlike the sweeping sundials constructed from pale lime plaster and heavy stone, this intricate circular masterpiece is forged entirely from solid brass. It stands as a striking testament to the precise, delicate art of the ancient metalworkers, offering a sudden, breathtaking shift in both texture and purpose. The towering stone structures around us were built to wait patiently for the celestial bodies to cross their monumental paths, but this specific instrument was thoughtfully designed to hold the entire turning universe in the palm of a mortal hand. Before we examine the gleaming brass itself, Let us take a long, restful moment to appreciate the colossal wooden frame that bears its immense, unyielding weight. The supporting pillars and heavy crossbeams are carved from deeply aged heartwood teak, harvested from the dense, ancient forests lying far to the south of the arid desert. This specific timber was chosen for its unparalleled iron-like density and its natural, enduring resistance to the abrasive, dry winds of the Rajasthani plains. Over the quiet decades, the deep, chocolate-brown grain of the teak has been polished to a glassy, almost liquid sheen by the constant, reverent touch of human hands and the rigorous, loving application of protective botanical oils. If you step close and breathe in the perfectly still air, you can easily detect the faint, lingering aroma of bitter almond oil and crushed natural beeswax, substances meticulously rubbed into the timber to prevent the harsh climate from cracking its beautiful surface. The edges of the heavy frame are not left bare. They are adorned with subtle, flowing, hand-carved motifs of heavy lotus petals and twisting, climbing vines, a gentle, artistic nod to the soft, organic world blooming quietly amidst the strict, rigid mathematics of astronomy. Thick, heavily forged bronze mounts securely bolt the wooden beams deep into the stone floor, anchoring the entire apparatus so firmly that even the strongest driving monsoon gales cannot induce a single shuddering tremor. Suspended gracefully within this dark wooden archway is the primary body of the Yantra Raj, a massive circular backplate known simply as the Martyr. The creation of a single flawless brass disc of this staggering circumference was a monumental, deeply impressive feat of 18th century metallurgy. Master founders in the bustling lower city would have laboured for days over roaring earthen furnaces. The heavy copper ore painstakingly mined from the deep, rocky veins of the ancient Aravalli range was melted down alongside raw, powdery zinc blending together in a heavily scorched clay crucible of blinding heat to form a liquid alloy of pure, flowing sunshine. The thick smoke from these ancient fires, scented heavily with the dark charcoal of hard acacia wood, would have painted the twilight skies above the brick foundries, poured carefully into vast moulds of tightly packed, incredibly fine river sand. The molten metal was allowed to cool with agonizing, beautiful slowness. This deeply patient cooling process was absolutely vital to prevent any warping, bubbling, or microscopic hidden fractures that could eventually distort the mathematical truth of the instrument. The resulting disc is impossibly heavy, a dense, unwavering anchor of solid matter. When the pale, sweeping light of the moon strikes this polished surface, it does not glare with the blinding, harsh intensity of a modern glass mirror. Instead, the brass absorbs the cool lunar rays and softens them, radiating a warm, muted amber glow that seems to emanate from deep within the metallic matrix itself. If you were to gently rest your fingertips flat against this broad surface, the sensation would be a profound, grounding coldness, a soothing chill that speaks of the deep, quiet earth from which the ores were originally extracted, immediately quieting any lingering nervous warmth of waking anxiety. To truly grasp the unfathomable quiet dedication poured into the Yantra Raj, one must gently lean in closer, bringing the weary eye mere inches from the golden brass. The entire sweeping expanse of the mater is completely covered in thousands of microscopic, flawlessly straight lines, perfectly concentric circles, and beautifully sweeping arcs. These are the intricate mathematical coordinates of the heavens, precise lines of altitude, azimuth, and celestial longitude, translated from the infinite three-dimensional void of space onto a heavy, flat, two-dimensional plane. The devoted artisans who etched these lines did not use heavy, clumsy hammers. They used remarkably slender, needle-sharp burins forged from the hardest, deeply tempered steel, pushing the tiny cutting edge through the resistant brass with the steady, rhythmic, deeply controlled pressure of the heel of their hand. A single ragged breath or a microscopic unexpected twitch of a tired muscle would have instantly ruined long months of exhaustive labor. Alongside these strict geometric demarcations are tiny, elegantly flowing scripts, a beautiful harmonious blending of ancient Sanskrit characters and sweeping graceful Arabic numerals. To ensure these vital, lifelong markings remained visible in the dim, shifting light of a flickering oil lamp, The engravers rubbed a thick, dark, fragrant paste made from collected soot and natural tree resin deeply into the shallow, microscopic trenches. The resulting visual contrast is mesmerizing. Deep, velvety black lines cutting sharply through the glowing golden expanse, creating a permanent, heavy map of eternity etched forever into cold, unyielding metal. Resting completely flush against this finely engraved backplate and securely pinned precisely at the dead mathematical center is the rete, a second, independently rotating layer of brass that transforms the instrument from a static, beautiful map into a dynamic, highly functioning calculating engine. The rete is not a solid, heavy disc, but rather an incredibly delicate, highly intricate cutout web. It is a true masterpiece of negative space, a physical philosophy where far more metal has been painstakingly filed away than left behind. The remaining brass forms a sweeping, elegant, and entirely organic cage of curving ribs and slender, pointed offshoots. Each of these beautifully sharpened points, curving gracefully like the heavy thorns of a wild, deep desert rose, represents the exact, permanently fixed position of a major star in the vast night sky. One specific, sharply polished pointer might silently track the fiery red glow of Aldebaran, the resting eye of the celestial bull, while another delicately reaches toward the pale, sapphire brilliance of distant Vega. By cutting away the vast bulk of the upper disk, the deeply patient astronomer is permitted to clearly see the intricate coordinate lines of the mater resting safely beneath it. As the descending moonlight filters silently through this complex golden web, it casts an intricate, overlapping matrix of sharp, deeply dark shadows onto the glowing backplate. When the ambient light slowly shifts its angle throughout the profoundly long night, these shadows subtly stretch, bend, and morph, creating a deeply hypnotic, totally silent optical dance that easily captivates the weary, resting mind. Imagine the deeply sensory, wonderfully grounding experience of operating this magnificent device in the absolute quietest hours of the night. The royal astronomer, wrapped thickly in heavy woolen shawls against the creeping chill, steps forward into the moonlight and slowly reaches out with both hands. He gently grasps the heavy, knurled outer rim of the rete, where the thick brass has been meticulously textured with tiny diamond-shaped cuts to provide a flawless, secure grip for cold, tired fingers. With a slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried exertion of physical force, he begins to turn the massive cutout disc. Because the instrument is so perfectly balanced and incredibly heavy, it does not spin freely, wildly, or loosely. It requires a steady, continuous, deeply mindful pressure, creating a profound physical connection between the soft, vulnerable human body and the unyielding mechanical cosmos. As the intricate brass web slowly glides over the solid brass backplate beneath it, the metallic friction produces a beautifully resonant, deeply soothing whisper. It is a sustained, echoing metallic sigh, a low, humming, rhythmic sound that reverberates softly through the dense wood of the surrounding frame and travels directly warmly down the astronomer's resting arms. This deeply resonant sound of heavy metal slowly sliding upon cold metal is perfectly lubricated by centuries of careful, loving use and the occasional microscopic application of fragrant essential oils. The resulting vibration is never jarring or harsh. It is entirely grounding, a deeply rhythmic physical pulse that effortlessly synchronizes your own resting heartbeat with the slow, inevitable rotation of the Earth. As the astronomer slowly aligns the sharp, curving pointer of a distant star with the engraved altitude line indicating the current fleeting moment, he essentially beautifully freezes time. He locks the sweeping, terrifying vastness of the unending universe into a manageable, beautifully contained, easily understood circle of heavy brass. Standing quietly before the Yantra Raj, watching the intricate, slow dance of its golden layers, you are gently invited to completely let go of your own earthly heavy burdens. The sheer, unfathomable scale of the cosmos, so elegantly measured and calmly contained within this metal ring, softly reminds you that the anxieties and rushing demands of the waking day are infinitesimally small. Here, in this quiet, deeply shadowed courtyard, Safely surrounded by ancient carved wood and glowing heavy brass, there is only the slow, predictable, and utterly peaceful turning of the stars ready to guide you gently, safely, and inevitably into a deep, untroubled, and beautiful slumber. As the resonant metallic hum of the Yantra Raj fades softly into the vast tapestry of the night, our unhurried footsteps guide us away from the heavy mathematical heart of the observatory. We drift slowly toward the high, sweeping perimeter walls that fiercely protect this silent sanctuary from the shifting desert dunes. Here, nestled securely against the towering red sandstone, the rigid geometry of the astronomical courtyard yields gracefully to a small hidden oasis of organic life. With every deliberate step, you can feel a profound, deeply grounding shift in the very texture of the earth beneath your soft leather slippers. The immense, flawlessly level paving slabs of pale stone, which for hours have radiated the dry, trapped heat of the afternoon sun, gradually taper off. In their place, your feet meet a narrow, beautifully shadowed pathway of densely packed, deeply rich, dark soil. The sensation is wonderfully forgiving. Unlike the unyielding masonry, this earth possesses a subtle, gentle spring, softly cushioning the weight of your tired body. As the heat of the paving stones is left behind, a refreshing, highly localized pocket of cool, humid air wraps around your ankles and slowly rises to embrace your resting shoulders. The intensely dry mineral scent of crushed limestone and oxidized brass is quietly replaced by something remarkably different. The heavy, comforting, and deeply ancient fragrance of damp loam, resting roots, and quiet, slow-growing life. Following this soft, earthy pathway, we discover the hidden source of this unexpected life-giving moisture. Running parallel to the towering perimeter wall is a narrow, incredibly shallow irrigation channel, a humble but vital lifeline carved carefully into the desert floor. This small canal is meticulously lined with rough, unglazed terracotta bricks, a striking visual and tactile contrast to the highly polished marble of the grand sundials. Let us pause for a long, peaceful moment to consider the quiet history held within these simple, red earthen blocks. Long before they were brought to the Jantar Mantar, master potters gathered heavy, wet clay from the distant, deeply shaded banks of an ancient, slow-moving river. The clay was kneaded rhythmically by hand, pressed into heavy wooden molds, and left to dry under the fierce sun before being slowly baked in roaring subterranean kilns. Because they were fired without a sealing glass glaze, these bricks remain beautifully porous, acting like heavy, rigid sponges. Through this channel flows pristine, icy water, drawn carefully from a deeply sunken stepwell hidden safely outside the thick observatory walls. This water has spent countless centuries filtering through vast subterranean layers of sandstone and limestone aquifers before finally reaching the surface. As it glides smoothly over the textured terracotta, it creates a faint, deeply rhythmic, and incredibly melodic sound. It is a soft, continuous bubbling gurgle shh, a fragile, aquatic lullaby that perfectly masks any distant, lingering echoes of the sleeping city. The porous bricks absorb just enough of this cold water to constantly exhale a rich, deeply intoxicating aroma. It is the distinct beloved scent of petrichor, the exact earthy fragrance of the first heavy monsoon rain striking parched desert soil. This scent acts as a natural, highly potent sedative for the wandering mind, anchoring your thoughts entirely to the quiet, damp earth and washing away the jagged, nervous energy of the waking world. Thriving abundantly, within this deeply sheltered, humid microclimate is a sprawling, wildly growing thicket of Rat Kirani, the deeply revered night-blooming jasmine, throughout the blistering, fiercely bright hours of the long Rajasthani day. This unassuming shrub is a master of quiet preservation. Its leaves fold slightly inward, conserving precious moisture, and its thousands of tiny, slender, pale green flower buds remain tightly, almost stubbornly sealed against the abrasive heat of the sun. But now, in the absolute velvety safety of the midnight hour, a magnificent, deeply silent botanical choreography is actively unfolding, triggered by the total absence of direct sunlight and the heavy, comforting drop in the ambient air temperature. The plant begins its nocturnal awakening. If you were to crouch down, bringing your resting gaze within mere inches of the dense foliage, You could almost witness the microscopic, deliberate movement of the petals. The tightly wound, tubular buds slowly, gracefully begin to loosen, the incredibly thin, fragile white petals feeling exactly like the finest, translucent silk, spun by master weavers, push gently outward against the cool night air. They uncurl with agonizing, beautiful slowness, a profound testament to the unhurried, eternal pace of the natural world. As thousands of these tiny, five-pointed blossoms fully open simultaneously, the dark, sprawling bush undergoes a breathtaking visual transformation. Under the pale, washing light of the full moon, the stark white flowers catch the silver luminescence, standing out brilliantly against the deeply shadowed, dark green leaves. The sprawling thicket suddenly looks as though a magnificent swirling galaxy of tiny fallen stars has become gently entangled in the branches, offering a soft, earthly reflection of the vast, glittering constellations that the grand stone instruments are busy tracking high above. It is a profoundly intimate, beautifully quiet spectacle hidden away in a dark corner of the courtyard, performing its silent, majestic dance solely for the resting earth and the watchful moon. Yet, as visually stunning as this nocturnal blooming may be, it is the invisible, overwhelming and deeply intoxicating fragrance of the Rat Ki Rani that truly captivates the heavy, tired senses. As the delicate white petals finally unfurl to their absolute fullest, they release a highly concentrated, profoundly rich perfume into the still, heavy midnight air. This is not a sharp, fleeting or purely floral scent. It is an incredibly complex, heavily layered and deeply narcotic aroma that has been prized by royal perfumers and wandering poets for centuries. The initial wave that gently greets you is overwhelmingly sweet, possessing the thick, golden richness of wild honey, slowly warming in the late afternoon sun. But as you draw the cool air deeper into your lungs, the underlying, more mysterious notes beautifully reveal themselves. There is a deeply grounding, slightly woody, resinous quality, mingling perfectly with a faint, warm hint of crushed cloves and sweet musk. Because the air in this walled corner of the courtyard is so flawlessly still, without a single stray breeze to scatter the heavy scent molecules, the fragrance pools and concentrates around you, it becomes almost tangible, feeling entirely like a soft, invisible, heavily weighted blanket settling gently over your tired shoulders. As you stand quietly beside the blooming thicket, simply breathing in the damp, perfumed air, a profound physiological shift begins to quietly take place within your completely relaxed body. The incredibly rich, sweet molecules of the jasmine scent travel smoothly through your olfactory senses, sending deep, immediate signals of absolute safety and profound calm directly to your resting brain. You can actually feel the physical response spreading slowly downward through your heavy limbs. The tight, holding muscles in your jaw completely soften and let go. The heavy, burdened weight of your shoulders drops a fraction of an inch, surrendering entirely to gravity. The rapid, shallow rhythm of your breathing, a lingering ghost of the day's frantic pace, effortlessly slows down, matching the long, unhurried, echoing heartbeat of the ancient observatory itself. The overwhelming, beautiful sweetness of the air wraps your conscious thoughts in a thick, velvety fog, gently dissolving the sharp edges of memory, worry, and anticipation. There is absolutely nothing left to solve, nowhere else you need to travel, and no tasks awaiting your immediate attention. You are perfectly anchored in this fragrant, damp, and deeply sheltered pocket of time, entirely enveloped by the slow, majestic breathing of the earth, drifting deeper and deeper into a state of unwavering, profound, and beautifully untroubled sleep. As we gently draw our awareness away from the heavy, intoxicating sweetness of the blooming jasmine bush, we allow our unhurried footsteps to guide us toward a different kind of sanctuary, hidden just a short distance away along the perimeter wall. Leaving the damp, fragrant earth of the garden behind, our soft leather slippers once again meet the solid, reassuring permanence of the stone pathways. The night air, saturated heavily with the perfume of the flowers, slowly begins to thin, making way for a profoundly different, deeply intellectual atmosphere. We are approaching the Pustakalaya, the sacred, closely guarded archive where the royal astronomers painstakingly store the vast accumulated wisdom of centuries. This repository is not an imposing, towering structure. Instead, it is a humble semi-subterranean chamber, thoughtfully designed to plunge deep into the cool, stable earth. A short, incredibly narrow flight of descending stone steps leads us softly downward. With each incredibly slow, deliberate step we take into the recessed stairwell, the ambient temperature drops noticeably. The thick, heavy masonry of the surrounding walls perfectly insulates this sunken space from the extreme, sweeping fluctuations of the harsh desert climate above. The air here is flawlessly still, dense, and remarkably cool, creating a perfect, unwavering microclimate designed entirely for the eternal preservation of fragile, ancient knowledge. It feels exactly like stepping into a deeply hidden, beautifully quiet stone lung that takes only one slow, massive breath every 100 years. Standing quietly at the bottom of the sunken stairwell, we are met by a breathtakingly massive, deeply aged wooden door that silently guards the entrance to the archive. This is not a simple, lightweight barrier. It is constructed from incredibly thick, solid planks of heavy, dark rosewood, a timber renowned for its profound density and beautiful resistance to the slow decay of time. The surface of the wood is deeply scored and beautifully textured, showing the faint, rhythmic marks of the ancient carpenter's adze that shaped it centuries ago. Running horizontally across the heavy wooden planks are wide, heavily forged straps of black iron, deeply studded with large, beautifully rounded iron nails that look entirely like heavy, dark iron teardrops frozen in time. Gently resting your warm hand against the incredibly cold, rough surface of one of these iron studs provides a profoundly grounding physical sensation. The door is secured by an incredibly complex, deeply heavy iron latch. If you were to slowly, carefully lift this heavy latch, the internal mechanisms would slide against one another with a deeply resonant, muffled, and entirely satisfying metallic clack. Pulling the massive door open requires a slow, deliberate, and sustained physical effort. Because the wood is so incredibly heavy and the hinges are so deeply ancient, the door does not swing freely. It moves with a profound, beautiful slowness, pushing against the thick, settled air of the room and producing an incredibly low, deeply resonant, groaning whisper that softly echoes up the stone stairwell, perfectly announcing your quiet arrival into the deeply hushed presence of history. As the heavy rosewood door swings slowly inward, we cross the worn stone threshold and step gently into the absolute, profound stillness of the archival chamber. The immediate sensory experience is overwhelmingly, beautifully olfactory. The scent trapped within this deeply sunken room is utterly unique, an incredibly rich, heavily layered perfume of preserved time that instantly, perfectly commands your entirely relaxed attention. The dominant, highly unmistakable aroma is the deeply sharp, incredibly clean, and profoundly cooling scent of natural camphor. Small crystalline blocks of this fragrant resin are carefully, strategically placed along the deeply carved stone shelves to silently ward off the destructive, invisible insects of the desert. Mingled perfectly with the sharp camphor is the slightly bitter, deeply earthy, and wonderfully green scent of completely dried neem leaves. These highly medicinal, beautifully brittle leaves have been meticulously tucked between the heavy stacks of paper for generations, their perfectly faded, pale green veins holding an ancient, deeply potent botanical magic. Beneath these sharp, protective aromas lies the profound, intensely heavy, and deeply comforting smell of the ancient manuscripts themselves. It is the incredibly dry, beautifully dusty, and slightly sweet scent of aging paper, heavily oxidized iron gall ink, and deeply resting, incredibly slow decay. This complex, deeply historical fragrance wraps completely around your tired mind like a heavy, deeply woven intellectual blanket, instantly slowing your racing thoughts and entirely replacing the chaotic worries of the modern world with a profound, unshakable sense of eternal, quiet permanence. As your deeply resting eyes slowly adjust to the incredibly faint, beautifully warm amber glow provided by a single heavily shielded oil lamp resting quietly in the corner, the magnificent, heavily textured contents of the archive finally reveal themselves. The walls of the sunken chamber are entirely lined with beautifully deep, incredibly thick shelves, completely carved directly from the solid red sandstone bedrock. Resting quietly upon these heavy stone ledges are not modern, perfectly bound books, but thousands of deeply ancient, heavily rolled scrolls and beautifully loose, untethered leaves of heavy manuscript. Each precious bundle is lovingly, painstakingly wrapped in a highly protective, incredibly soft square of pure, unbleached cotton or deeply faded, beautifully delicate silk. Let us softly approach one of the deeply carved shelves and gently, slowly lift a single wrapped bundle into our resting hands. The physical weight of the manuscript is profoundly surprising. It feels beautifully dense, incredibly solid, and deeply substantial. A true heavy physical manifestation of the concentrated, silent human thought completely trapped within. The fabric wrapping the bundle has been deeply softened by centuries of quiet handling, feeling exactly like the incredibly delicate, highly fragile skin of a deeply resting, ancient elder. Tied completely around the beautiful, soft silk is a highly intricate, deeply braided cord of heavy cotton thread, dyed a profoundly faded, beautifully muted shade of natural indigo. Gently, incredibly slowly pulling the deeply worn loop of the knot, the cotton cord silently, beautifully slips free, falling entirely away with a completely soft, incredibly faint, perfectly rhythmic whisper against the heavy fabric. With the protective silk gently, slowly folded back like the heavy velvet curtains of a completely miniature, deeply silent theatre, the beautiful ancient manuscript itself is finally perfectly exposed to the faint amber light. The heavy pages are not made from entirely smooth, completely manufactured modern paper. They are meticulously, painstakingly crafted from deeply soaked, heavily pounded bark of the ancient birch tree, a material deeply known as bojpatra. The incredibly tactile, highly physical sensation of gently brushing your fingertips across the completely raw, slightly frayed, incredibly beautifully uneven edges of this ancient bark is profoundly, deeply mesmerizing. The surface is incredibly smooth yet perfectly, beautifully textured with microscopic, entirely natural horizontal striations that exactly mimic the incredibly slow, beautifully rhythmic flow of a completely quiet, perfectly steady, deeply ancient river. Carefully, slowly turning a single heavy leaf of the bojpatra produces a deeply resonant, incredibly crisp, perfectly dry rustling sound. It is an incredibly delicate, beautifully brittle, crackle, a profoundly quiet, incredibly intimate acoustic experience that completely, entirely fills the silent, heavy air of the sunken room. The deeply dark, beautifully sweeping, perfectly rhythmic script flowing endlessly across the pale bark is inscribed with absolute, entirely flawless precision. Staring perfectly into these ancient, heavily sweeping letters, you effortlessly, completely lose your tired sense of the fleeting present. You are profoundly, deeply physically connected to the exact, perfectly quiet moment centuries ago when a dedicated, perfectly silent scholar first pressed his highly sharpened reed pen to this very page. Surrounded completely by the deeply heavy scent of camphor, the deeply beautiful texture of fading silk, and the profoundly quiet rustling of the ancient birch bark, your weary mind perfectly, entirely surrenders to the vast, comforting, and deeply eternal silence of beautifully preserved history. As we carefully rewrap the ancient birchbark manuscript in its beautifully faded silk, securing the soft indigo knot with slow, deliberate reverence, we gently leave the profound, intellectual silence of the sunken archive behind, ascending the narrow, cool stone steps back into the vast, open courtyard. The incredibly heavy, deeply narcotic perfume of the night-blooming jasmine welcomes us once again, beautifully mingling with the crisp, descending chill of the deep desert midnight. The intense, highly focused mental labor of tracking the infinite cosmos and deciphering ancient geometric texts demands an incredibly steady, perfectly grounded physical vessel. To maintain this profound, unwavering nocturnal stamina, the silent, dedicated sky watchers partake in a completely simple, deeply grounding, and beautifully slow ritual of nourishment. Drifting quietly across the moon-washed paving stones, we approach a highly secluded, completely sheltered corner of the complex, situated far away from the massive, towering precision of the great sundials. Here, nestled safely within a small, beautifully arched pavilion constructed of deeply warm, heavy red sandstone, glows the incredibly soft, perfectly steady, and deeply comforting light of a small, carefully tended cooking hearth. The air approaching this quiet pavilion is immediately beautifully transformed, carrying the intensely rich, deeply savory, and profoundly comforting aroma of roasting grains and slowly clarifying butter, instantly triggering a deeply primal, entirely heavy sense of complete physical safety and deep relaxation within the tired body. Stepping gently under the low, sweeping archway of the heavy stone pavilion, the ambient temperature rises beautifully, perfectly enveloping you in a deeply soft, incredibly comforting blanket of radiant, physical warmth. In the absolute, perfectly flawless mathematical center of the smooth, heavily plastered floor sits an incredibly small, perfectly round, meticulously constructed clay oven, traditionally known as a chulya. This humble, incredibly vital earthen stove is not blazing with a roaring, aggressive, wildly uncontrollable fire. Rather, it harbors a deeply quiet, perfectly steady, entirely hypnotic bed of glowing, deeply red acacia wood embers. The profoundly dense, heavy desert wood burns with an incredibly slow, perfectly even, and beautifully patient heat, producing almost zero smoke but radiating an intensely deep, profound thermal energy that effortlessly, beautifully thaws the creeping midnight chill from your resting bones. If you were to sit perfectly quietly on the thick, incredibly soft, highly woven woolen rug placed carefully near the hearth, you could easily beautifully hear the profoundly soothing, incredibly microscopic acoustics of the resting fire. It is a completely soft, deeply delicate, beautifully rhythmic popping and hissing sound, an entirely gentle crackle pop that deeply harmonizes with the slow, peaceful, rhythmic pacing of your own resting breath. The heavy, deeply textured mud walls of the small pavilion perfectly absorb the beautiful, flickering golden light of the embers, deeply softening the entire visual landscape into a profoundly blurred, incredibly gentle, highly soothing amber haze. With a completely fluid, deeply practiced, and incredibly gentle motion, the elder astronomer carefully lifts the perfectly flat, raw disk of soft wheat dough and lays it softly upon the fiercely hot, heavy iron skillet. The very moment the cool, slightly damp dough touches the scorching, deeply seasoned metal, a profoundly beautiful, entirely microscopic, and highly sensory reaction instantly occurs. The air is immediately filled with a deeply resonant, incredibly satisfying and beautifully sharp hissing sound, a wet, highly rapid tsh that instantly commands your entirely relaxed auditory focus. As the intense, perfectly even heat of the heavy iron rapidly penetrates the flat dough, the deeply complex, incredibly rich, and entirely mouth-watering aroma of rapidly toasting grain completely saturates the confined, warm air of the heavy stone pavilion. It is a profoundly earthy, incredibly grounding, and highly comforting scent that smells precisely like sun-baked summer wheat fields, slow, heavy grinding stones, and the profound essence of pure, sustaining life. Within mere slowly passing moments, small, beautiful blisters of trapped hot steam begin to slowly rise and expand across the textured surface of the flatbread. Using a long, gracefully thin, hand-forged iron tong, he gently and smoothly flips the toasting bread, revealing a beautiful, slightly charred, dark brown pattern of heavily toasted spots. The visual contrast between the pale, dry wheat and the deeply dark, scorched blisters is completely mesmerizing, an entirely organic, perfectly imperfect map of heat and sustenance completely unfolding right before your resting eyes. To complete this beautifully simple, profoundly grounding and quiet nocturnal ritual, the astronomer gently transfers the fully puffed, heavily toasted, hot flatbread from the iron skillet directly onto a beautifully simple, unglazed, highly textured clay plate. Sitting quietly beside the glowing hearth rests a small, incredibly heavy, deeply polished brass bowl filled with freshly clarified butter, known throughout the subcontinent as pure ghee. The gentle, ambient, radiant heat warming the air of the stone pavilion keeps this rich golden liquid in a beautifully flawless, entirely melted state. Taking a small, intricately carved, deeply worn wooden spoon, he carefully scoops a tiny, perfectly golden pool of the deeply fragrant, warm liquid and lets it slowly, beautifully cascade over the intensely hot, freshly baked flatbread. The moment the incredibly rich, heavy butter touches the fiercely hot, highly porous surface of the toasted grain, it instantly sizzles, rapidly melting deep into the incredibly soft, completely hidden interior pockets of the heavy bread. The overwhelming, entirely intoxicating, deeply rich fragrance that instantly rises from the warm clay plate is an absolute, profoundly comforting masterpiece of sensory perfection. It is an incredibly rich, perfectly nutty, entirely sweet, and deeply grounding aroma that wraps completely around your resting, tired mind. It anchors you instantly and securely to the heavy, safe earth, completely dissolving any remaining mental abstractions about the distant, cold stars and replaces them with the undeniable, deeply physical and entirely warm reality of a perfectly quiet, deeply satisfying and highly comforting moment of human rest. As we gently step away from the deeply warm, profoundly comforting and beautifully fragrant embrace of the astronomer's quiet cooking hearth, the rich, heavy scent of toasted wheat and melted butter slowly begins to fade into the cool, expansive night. Our unhurried, silent footsteps guide us back into the vast, open heart of the main courtyard. The immense, heavily plastered stone instruments stand completely motionless under the pale, washing light of the full moon, casting impossibly long, razor-sharp shadows across the completely flat, pale paving stones. We have witnessed the profound, meticulous exactitude of the celestial measurements, the delicate, intricate beauty of the golden brass discs, and the deeply grounding, highly physical routines that beautifully sustain the silent sky watchers. Yet beneath the vast, sweeping scale of this monumental architecture and the complex, deeply mathematical pursuit of tracking the infinite heavens, there lies a much deeper, profoundly quiet, entirely invisible philosophical current flowing continuously through the silent, heavy air of the Jantar Mantar. It is a slow, deeply patient, and incredibly peaceful meditation on the profound nature of time itself. Not time as a frantic, rushing, highly demanding currency of the modern waking world, but time as a deeply slow, entirely vast, perfectly unshakable, and highly comforting river. Let us find a perfectly smooth, heavily shaded, profoundly comfortable stone bench near the base of the grand sundial, gently lower our tired bodies onto the deeply cool, supportive masonry, and allow our heavily resting minds to slowly, beautifully sink into this profound ancient philosophy. In the completely chaotic, entirely demanding, incredibly brightly lit, and highly stressful modern world we have gently left far behind tonight, the concept of time is often perceived as a harsh, highly aggressive, and deeply unrelenting predator. It is a terrifying, rapidly ticking clock that constantly, aggressively demands our immediate, frantic attention, completely forcing us to rush endlessly from one highly stressful, completely insignificant task to the very next. Time, in that distant, anxious reality, is always rapidly running out, completely slipping through our frantically grasping fingers like incredibly fine, fiercely dry, highly abrasive desert sand. But here, perfectly resting within the heavy, deeply secure and entirely silent walled sanctuary of the ancient observatory, that highly aggressive, deeply terrifying illusion of time completely, beautifully, and instantly shatters. The master architects and deeply devoted astronomers who slowly, painstakingly raised these colossal stone instruments did not perceive time as an enemy to be fought, conquered, or desperately managed. Instead, they deeply understood time as an entirely majestic, profoundly vast, highly predictable, and perfectly eternal cosmic ocean. They built these towering, beautifully sloping, heavily plastered structures not to desperately trap or furiously control the fleeting minutes, but simply to respectfully, quietly, and beautifully observe the incredibly slow, majestic, tanned, completely peaceful ripples gently passing across its deeply dark, unfathomable surface. This profound realization of deeply sweeping, completely vast cosmic timer acts upon the exhausted, highly anxious mind exactly like an incredibly heavy, profoundly soft, entirely comforting, deeply weighted physical blanket. As you deeply, slowly absorb the majestic, completely unhurried pacing of the ancient stone shadow, the frantic, deeply tight, highly stressful mental knots that completely bind your consciousness during the glaring daylight hours begin to slowly, entirely, and beautifully unravel. The deeply pressing deadline, the highly complex, totally unresolved conflict, the incredibly anxious, deeply fearful anticipation of an uncertain future. All of these highly heavy, entirely sharp, deeply painful mental burdens suddenly, perfectly, beautifully lose their immense gripping weight, when entirely perfectly compared to the incredibly slow, deeply ancient, highly massive, perfectly smooth turning of the Milky Way, measured quietly by towering, cold, heavily plastered stone monuments that have stood perfectly, entirely still for hundreds of sweeping, silent years. Your individual, personal anxieties are beautifully, profoundly reduced to the absolutely microscopic, totally harmless insignificance of a single, entirely tiny, highly fragile grain of soft, dry desert dust, gently, softly blowing completely away on the cool, deeply resting midnight breeze. You are completely, entirely free to simply let them all go, totally surrendering them perfectly into the vast, deeply welcoming, completely empty, highly peaceful void of the beautiful dark night. As the profound, highly comforting philosophy of incredibly slow, majestic, vast cosmic time settles deeply, permanently, and warmly into the very core of your resting chest, a second, equally powerful, entirely peaceful realization begins to gently wash over your heavily relaxing mind. We are sitting perfectly still in the very heart of one of the most incredibly complex, deeply brilliant, highly sophisticated, entirely mathematical astronomical observatories ever perfectly constructed in the deeply ancient world. The minds that originally painstakingly conceived of these colossal, entirely perfect, sweeping geometric structures, the highly brilliant architects who flawlessly drafted the microscopic complex plans, and the incredibly skilled, deeply patient master artisans who physically, heavily carved these massive, towering stone instruments, possessed a profound, utterly staggering level of intense human genius. They deeply, entirely understood the highly complex, incredibly nuanced, completely mathematical language of the vast, turning heavens long before the harsh, deeply glaring advent of modern, completely mechanized, perfectly digital telescopes. Yet, as you look slowly, deeply around the pale, moonlit, completely silent, heavily shadowed courtyard, a profound, incredibly humbling, entirely peaceful truth completely reveals itself. You absolutely do not know a single one of their highly individual, completely personal names. The vast, sweeping river of deeply unrecorded, completely silent history has gently, perfectly, entirely washed away the deeply specific, highly personal identities of the brilliant men who entirely devoted their quiet, resting lives to building and perfectly maintaining this colossal, sweeping stone sanctuary. Their deeply personal ambitions, their incredibly specific, highly localized daily struggles, their deeply passionate, highly fiery arguments over microscopic, tiny geometric calculations, their profound, highly private moments of deeply brilliant intellectual triumph, all of these intensely human, entirely individual experiences have completely, perfectly dissolved into the vast, deeply silent, incredibly heavy, entirely comforting mist of passing, completely quiet centuries. All that completely, beautifully, and entirely remains of their incredibly intense, highly focused, deeply profound intellectual existence is the heavy, pale, perfectly plastered stone, the deeply inscribed, incredibly sharp white marble scales, and the solid, completely unyielding, heavy golden brass discs perfectly, quietly reflecting the pale silver moonlight. They completely, entirely poured the absolute entirety of their deeply brilliant, highly focused minds into perfectly creating a sweeping, massive, eternal physical reflection of the infinite, turning cosmos, entirely, beautifully allowing their own deeply small, highly fragile, perfectly human egos to gently, completely, quietly fade away into the vast, sweeping, perfectly silent background of the completely uncaring, highly beautiful universe. This profound, deeply beautiful loss of the heavily specific, intensely demanding individual ego is not a deeply sad, highly tragic, or completely entirely mournful realization. Rather, it is incredibly, profoundly, deeply, deeply liberating. In our highly modern, completely frantic, intensely bright, and totally exhausting waking lives, we carry an incredibly heavy, profoundly crushing, perfectly unnecessary burden of deeply intense personal significance. We frantically, endlessly, entirely worry about exactly how we are specifically perceived. We desperately, anxiously obsess over perfectly curating our highly individual, entirely personal legacies. And we completely, heavily exhaust ourselves desperately, entirely trying to forcefully carve our own tiny, completely insignificant names into the completely unyielding, highly resistant, perfectly indifferent bedrock of a completely rushing, highly chaotic world. But sitting here, completely, entirely safely within the deep, heavily protective, highly silent, completely ancient walls of the Jantar Mantar, completely, entirely, perfectly dwarfed by the massive, towering, deeply sweeping stone monuments, perfectly, entirely dedicated solely, completely to the vast, entirely eternal, completely slow movements of the infinite stars, that highly crushing, deeply exhausting, completely heavy weight of extreme personal importance, simply, perfectly, completely beautifully, entirely falls away. You are gently, profoundly, entirely reminded that you are completely, beautifully, merely a highly transient, entirely temporary, completely microscopic, perfectly, deeply resting witness to an incredibly vast, profoundly majestic, highly sweeping, perfectly continuous cosmic phenomenon that entirely, perfectly, vastly predates your tiny, fleeting, entirely resting existence and will completely, entirely, deeply, perfectly outlast it by completely unfathomable, highly massive, incredibly sweeping eons. The incredibly slow, completely unhurried, perfectly majestic, deeply rotating stars perfectly glittering high above. You do not know your incredibly specific, entirely small, deeply personal name, and they completely, entirely, perfectly, absolutely do not deeply care. The towering, heavily plastered, perfectly smooth stone sundial does not judge your completely, entirely, heavily, entirely, deeply, highly, entirely flawed past, nor does it frantically, aggressively, completely anticipate your deeply, entirely, completely, highly uncertain future. It merely, perfectly, entirely, completely, deeply stands exactly in the completely vast, incredibly deep, entirely heavy, deeply, perfectly resting, totally profound, completely, entirely present moment, perfectly silently, entirely heavily, entirely tracking the beautiful, deeply slow, entirely sweeping, completely majestic, completely deeply highly turning, entirely shadow of the completely deep, perfectly resting, incredibly, entirely complete now. As the profoundly liberating, entirely peaceful realization of your own cosmic insignificance settles permanently into your completely relaxed mind, the physical sensation of the surrounding night begins to slowly, beautifully alter its texture. The air within the heavy, protective stone walls of the Jantar Mantar no longer feels like empty, highly transparent, invisible space. Instead, as your deeply tired, completely resting senses continue to gently soften and beautifully blur, the midnight darkness slowly takes on a profound, incredibly soothing, highly palpable physical density. It is as if the deeply bruised, entirely velvet indigo of the sky has slowly, silently begun to softly precipitate, gently settling down into the quiet, heavily shadowed courtyard. The atmosphere feels incredibly thick, deeply rich, and profoundly soft, exactly like a massive, beautifully invisible ocean of incredibly fine, heavily woven dark silk slowly, gently pouring over the towering, heavily plastered geometric instruments and pooling perfectly upon the cool, highly smooth, pale paving stones where you quietly rest. This profound, heavily gathering darkness is not something to be feared. It does not hold the sharp, terrifying, anxious unknowns of a frantic, rushing, waking nightmare. Rather, it is an incredibly protective, deeply heavy, entirely maternal presence. It entirely wraps around your perfectly resting, heavily relaxed physical form, gently, beautifully sealing you perfectly away from the glaring, completely demanding, highly abrasive sensory overload of the distant daylight world. Let your resting, incredibly tired eyes slowly, gently trace the sweeping, profoundly massive, perfectly dark outline of the towering Ram Yantra, silhouetted against the glittering, heavily starred sky. Because the ambient, pale silver light of the moon is slowly, inevitably beginning its long, graceful, deeply sweeping descent toward the completely hidden, highly distant western horizon. The incredibly sharp, perfectly mathematical edges of the deeply shadowed masonry are slowly, beautifully losing their strict, entirely rigid geometric definition. The absolute perfectly hard lines between the heavy resting earth and the vast sweeping sky are gently dissolving, perfectly smudging into a profoundly soft, incredibly heavy, beautifully gentle gradient of deeply resting, perfectly quiet shadow. As the physical, entirely visual world slowly, gracefully begins to beautifully fade and completely retreat into the heavy velvet dark, your deeply internal, highly physical awareness of your own resting, tired body becomes profoundly magnified, yet incredibly, beautifully soft. Focus your slowly drifting, entirely peaceful attention entirely on the profound physical sensation of completely, deeply heavy gravity, gently pulling you entirely downward. The solid, incredibly cool, perfectly smooth stone bench beneath you is completely, entirely unwavering. It perfectly, beautifully accepts the entire, completely heavy, completely exhausted weight of your deeply resting physical form without a single, entirely microscopic, highly audible complaint. You do not need to hold yourself completely, perfectly upright anymore. The incredibly heavy, deeply tired muscles in your lower back, which have perfectly, silently supported you throughout the incredibly long, highly demanding, entirely rushing day, completely, finally surrender, gently melting into the highly supportive, deeply cool embrace of the ancient, completely resting masonry. Feel this profound, beautifully heavy, incredibly comfortable sensation of deep, physical release slowly, gracefully spreading outward. The intensely tight, completely holding muscles in your entirely resting shoulders deeply, perfectly drop a final heavy fraction of an inch, entirely sliding down away from your neck. The deeply heavy, incredibly tired, perfectly resting arms resting quietly in your lap feel profoundly, beautifully weighted, as if they are completely filled with incredibly warm, deeply heavy, completely liquid sand. Even your highly delicate, entirely tired fingers, which have been constantly grasping, typing, and reaching throughout the long, deeply exhausting waking hours, lie completely, beautifully still. They are perfectly uncurled, heavily resting like deeply sleeping, quiet stones completely at the very bottom of a highly quiet, deeply resting, entirely slow river. There is entirely, absolutely no physical tension left anywhere. There is only the highly complete, profoundly deep, heavily restful sensation of deep, profound, entirely restful surrender to the entirely heavy, completely comforting pull of the completely deeply dark, perfectly resting, perfectly quiet earth. As your breathing synchronizes flawlessly with the deeply patient, incredibly slow rhythm of the cooling masonry, you become acutely aware of the subtle microscopic temperature shifts occurring all around you. The massive red sandstone walls, which had greedily absorbed the fierce solar radiation throughout the blazing afternoon, are now in the final quiet stages of surrendering their deeply stored thermal energy. If you hover your incredibly relaxed heavy palm just an inch above the surface of the stone bench, you can actually feel a faint, beautifully weak, ghostly convection current. It is a profoundly gentle, invisible exhalation of ancient warmth, rising slowly upward to gently caress the underside of your weary arm. This deeply soothing, highly localized radiant heat creates a perfect, entirely harmonious microclimate immediately surrounding your resting body, perfectly offsetting the gradually deepening, crisp chill that is slowly descending from the vast high desert atmosphere. This incredibly delicate, perfectly balanced thermal cocoon completely envelops you, acting as a profoundly comforting, deeply physical barrier against the vast, empty coldness of the infinite cosmos, expanding silently above. You are not adrift in the terrifying void of space. You are safely, deeply anchored to a heavy, warm, entirely supportive celestial body that is currently turning its back to the sun, so that you may finally, perfectly rest. The deeply textured, highly porous lime plaster of the nearby sundials, holding a slightly different thermal capacity than the solid sandstone, emits its own incredibly faint, deeply subtle coolness. The beautiful, entirely physical interplay between these microscopic, deeply silent pockets of ancient warmth and descending atmospheric chill creates a profoundly soothing, incredibly hypnotic tactile symphony against your completely relaxed skin, a gentle, invisible massage that slowly, perfectly lulls your heavy, resting mind into a state of absolute, completely unwavering, and deeply beautiful tranquility. As the heavy, comforting blanket of physical relaxation wraps securely around your resting form, your weary attention is gently drawn to a small, intimately scaled object resting quietly on a deeply carved stone ledge just a few feet from your bench. Stark, beautiful contrast to the colossal, sweeping masonry of the grand sundials that dominate the courtyard. This is a delicate, highly personal instrument of timekeeping, left behind by a weary ancient scholar who has long since retired for the night. It is a beautifully crafted sand glass, housed within a remarkably intricate frame of deeply oiled sandalwood. The fragrance of this precious imported wood is profoundly soothing, a rich, creamy, slightly sweet aroma that rises faintly into the cool night air, beautifully complementing the lingering earthy scent of the blooming jasmine nearby. The wooden pillars of the frame have been polished by countless generations of reverent, seeking hands, their surfaces worn to a breathtakingly smooth, frictionless finish that softly catches the incredibly faint ambient starlight. The glass bulbs themselves are a marvel of ancient, unhurried craftsmanship. They were not manufactured in a pristine, cold, modern factory, but meticulously hand-blown by a master artisan over a glowing red-hot charcoal forge. Because of this beautifully organic human origin, the glass is delightfully imperfect. It is incredibly thick and heavy at the sturdy bases, yet remarkably, terrifyingly thin at the delicate, pinched waist. Within the glass walls, tiny, completely harmless air bubbles are permanently trapped, looking exactly like microscopic, frozen dewdrops suspended forever within the clear, cooling silica. Contained entirely within these fragile, hand-blown glass chambers is not ordinary, coarse beach sand, but a meticulously sifted, heavily refined powder of pure desert quartz and crushed white marble. During the glaring, abrasive hours of the daytime, this fine powder would reflect the fierce sun with a blinding, harsh intensity. But now, in the deep velvet sanctuary of the midnight hour, the falling sand takes on a soft, muted, ashen hue, resembling a tiny, captive dune of crushed, heavy moonbeams. If you simply allow your heavy, resting eyes to focus softly on the incredibly narrow waist of the glass, you can watch the mesmerizing, continuous, and profoundly unhurried descent of the crushed stone. It does not rush, it does not pour in a chaotic, desperate, or frantic stream. It falls with a beautiful, mathematical, and deeply hypnotic consistency. Grain by microscopic grain, the sand slips silently through the narrow aperture, surrendering entirely to the gentle, inevitable, and highly comforting pull of gravity. It is a profoundly visual, deeply physical representation of the act of letting go. As each tiny individual grain falls, you can easily imagine it representing a single lingering thought, a tiny fragment of waking anxiety or a stray, useless worry from the distant, exhausted day. One by one, they detach smoothly from the heavy, cluttered space of the upper bulb, which represents your conscious, highly active waking mind, and fall gracefully, silently away into the dark. They gather quietly in the lower glass chamber, forming a soft, gently sloping, and perfectly stable mound of quiet dust. This lower bulb represents the vast, welcoming, and beautifully empty space of your deep, untroubled subconscious. As the upper chamber slowly, inevitably empties itself of every last heavy grain of sand, your tired mind simultaneously, beautifully empties itself of every last demanding, lingering thought. The acoustic accompaniment to this visual descent is incredibly subtle, resting gently at the very absolute edge of human hearing. It is not a loud, mechanical ticking clock that harshly jars the resting nerves, but a continuous papery, deeply sibilant whisper, soft, endless, rhythmic shh, resembling the incredibly soothing sound of a completely calm, impossibly distant ocean gently sliding across a flat, smooth beach of dark, polished pebbles. This incredibly delicate, granular rustle acts upon your tired mind as a continuous looping acoustic lullaby. It perfectly masks the absolute profound silence of the surrounding stone courtyard, giving your tired auditory senses a tiny, completely harmless, and beautifully rhythmic focal point. You do not need to analyze the sound. You only need to let it wash completely over you, a gentle, invisible acoustic tide that slowly, systematically, and beautifully erodes the very last stubborn cliffs of your wakefulness. while the tiny sandalwood sandglass quietly measures the microscopic fleeting seconds. The vast, silent cosmic clock of the Jantar Mantar continues its sweeping, majestic, and entirely unhurried rotation. If you slowly, lazily lift your heavy, resting gaze away from the falling sand and look out toward the vast, open horizon, you will notice a profound, deeply beautiful shift in the nocturnal atmosphere. The brilliant, pale silver moon, which has served as the silent, glowing lantern for our quiet, deeply peaceful journey through the observatory, has now finally begun its incredibly slow, graceful descent. It is sinking heavily, quietly behind the jagged, deeply shadowed silhouette of the distant Aravalli Hills. As the massive lunar disk dips lower and lower into the velvet sky, the quality of the ambient light completely, beautifully transforms. The stark, liquid silver radiance wonderfully softens into a deeply muted, heavily bruised, and incredibly gentle bronze. This fading, incredibly tired light struggles to cast the remarkably sharp, razor-thin geometric shadows that defined the quiet courtyard just a single hour ago. The deeply hard, unyielding lines of the massive plastered gnomons and the sweeping sunken marble bowls begin to gracefully, inevitably lose their strict mathematical definition. The sharp edges of the heavy shadows blur, smudge, and gently expand outward, bleeding softly and seamlessly into the pale paving stones beneath your resting feet. The entire architectural landscape of the ancient observatory is slowly, beautifully melting into a single, cohesive tapestry of soft rolling silhouettes and deep, highly comforting darkness. Your heavy, incredibly tired eyes no longer need to work to define the rigid shapes around you. The exhausting necessity for sharp, clear, highly focused, waking vision is gently, permanently lifted away from your weary brow. The surrounding world is becoming delightfully, wonderfully, and entirely out of focus. The deep indigo of the upper sky slowly, gracefully deepens into a profound, fathomless, and heavily weighted charcoal grey. The glittering canopy of ancient stars above seems to respond directly to the retreating moonlight by shining with a much softer, deeply sleepier rhythm. They no longer pierce the velvet darkness with a cold, hard, unblinking brilliance. Instead, they pulse and waver gently, looking exactly like incredibly distant, beautifully fragile fireflies caught lazily in the thick, slow-moving, deeply heavy currents of the upper atmosphere. The air itself seems to physically thicken around you, taking on the luxurious, heavy, completely soft drape of a dark velvet curtain that is slowly, inevitably closing over the brilliantly lit, exhausting stage of the modern waking world. As the heavy, deeply comforting darkness continues its slow, completely inevitable descent over the sprawling ancient courtyard, the boundaries that separate your resting physical form from the vast, sleeping world around you begin to beautifully, gracefully dissolve. The solid, remarkably cool, heavily plastered stone bench beneath you no longer feels like a separate, unyielding object constructed by human hands centuries ago. Instead, it feels as though the massive, heavy masonry has slowly softened, gently molding itself perfectly to the exact contours of your exhausted, resting body. You are not merely sitting upon the stone, you are becoming an integral, deeply quiet part of the silent architecture itself. The heavy, profoundly tired muscles in your legs and arms have entirely surrendered their grip on the waking world, sinking so deeply into the comforting chill of the ancient earth that you can scarcely tell where your physical weight ends and the foundational bedrock of the Jantar Mantar beautifully begins. The overwhelming, highly demanding sensation of having a dense, heavy physical body at all is slowly, wonderfully slipping away, replaced by a profound floating lightness, as if you are slowly becoming a creature composed entirely of soft, exhaling breath and deeply resting, quiet thought. In this beautifully heavy, deeply blurred, and completely relaxed state of being, your slowly drifting, half-closed eyes catch the incredibly faint, profoundly subtle movement of something unimaginably small, because the brilliant, harsh light of the silver moon has finally dropped completely below the jagged, distant horizon. The courtyard is illuminated only by the incredibly soft, heavily diffused, profoundly weak starlight filtering down through the thick, velvet atmosphere. In this deeply muted, profoundly gentle illumination, a single highly isolated shaft of ambient starlight manages to gently slip through a narrow, perfectly carved vertical slit in the towering red sandstone wall beside you. This incredibly faint, beautifully weak beam of celestial light strikes the dark, entirely still air of the courtyard, perfectly revealing a microscopic, silent, and deeply hypnotic spectacle. Suspended completely weightlessly within this faint, glowing shaft of ancient light are thousands upon thousands of tiny, completely silent, beautifully drifting dust motes. They are not the heavy, abrasive, completely chaotic dust of a bustling, rushing city street. They are incredibly fine, deeply ancient particles of crushed terracotta, pulverized white marble, and incredibly dry, deeply fragrant desert pollen, gently lifted into the air hours ago by the long-forgotten resting daytime winds. Watch them as they move. They do not fall straight down, completely rushing aggressively toward the hard, unyielding earth. They drift, they float, they rise and dip with agonizing, beautiful, and profoundly mesmerizing slowness. They are entirely subject to the incredibly faint, utterly imperceptible, deeply gentle microcurrents of the cooling, resting night air. Their microscopic, perfectly silent journey is entirely random, completely without destination, absolutely devoid of any frantic, pushing urgency. One tiny, glittering mote of pale lime plaster gently spirals upward, catching the faint starlight for a deeply brief, incredibly beautiful, completely silent fraction of a second, before gracefully, perfectly drifting outward, seamlessly disappearing back into the heavy, profound, utterly comforting blanket of the surrounding velvet darkness. Another tiny, incredibly soft fragment of dried jasmine pollen slowly, rhythmically dips downward, performing a beautifully complex, completely unhurried, utterly silent waltz with a microscopic grain of crushed quartz. Their completely silent, deeply chaotic, entirely peaceful dance is profoundly hypnotic. Your deeply resting, heavily tired eyes follow their completely unpredictable, entirely floating paths back and forth, up and down, side to gently resting side. The incredibly slow, completely aimless movement of these tiny, beautiful particles beautifully mirrors the deeply loosening, completely untethering, highly relaxing state of your own resting mind. Your thoughts, which just hours ago were heavy, entirely urgent, perfectly structured, and completely demanding, have now gracefully fractured into incredibly small, beautifully disjointed, entirely harmless, and completely floating fragments of quiet memory. Stray, entirely unattached image of a completely smooth, pale stone slowly surfaces, then gently drifts away. A faint, incredibly soft, deeply distant echo of the heavily struck brass gong slowly ripples through your mind, entirely devoid of any demanding meaning, before completely, beautifully fading into the quiet, dark, deeply comforting, perfectly isolated memory of the rich, heavy scent of toasted wheat, slowly rises and then gently dissipates like a deeply thin, incredibly fragile wisp of resting smoke. You do not entirely need to grab onto any of these floating, deeply drifting thoughts. You absolutely do not need to fiercely analyze them, strictly organize them, or aggressively force them into a completely logical, highly demanding narrative. You can simply beautifully, entirely allow them to float, to drift, to gracefully, silently spiral through the vast, completely empty, highly peaceful space of your deeply resting consciousness, exactly like the completely silent, beautifully illuminated, perfectly aimless dust motes drifting endlessly through the faint, ancient starlight. The deeply slow, incredibly rhythmic, beautifully continuous sound of your own resting breath is now the absolute only anchor completely tying you to the profoundly quiet, deeply sleeping physical world. It is a completely soft, incredibly deeply resonant, highly continuous, perfectly beautiful oceanic sound. The cool, heavy, deeply fragrant night air completely enters your deeply relaxed, entirely resting chest, bringing a profound, heavily weighted, entirely complete sensation of absolute perfect peace. The slightly warm, incredibly heavy air slowly, gracefully leaves your body, carrying completely, entirely away the absolute last, deeply stubborn, highly microscopic, entirely lingering fragments of waking tension. breathe in the deep, heavy, perfectly quiet dust. Breathe out the frantic, rushing, entirely exhausting day. Breathe in the incredibly slow, beautifully sweeping, completely eternal rotation of the massive resting stars. Breathe out the sharp, highly demanding, completely finite worries of tomorrow. The ancient, heavily plastered, perfectly geometric instruments of the Jantar Mantar are no longer completely solid, entirely distinct, highly towering structures of hard, unyielding stone. In the deeply heavy, incredibly soft, completely blurring edges of your descending, resting sleep, they have beautifully, seamlessly become vast, highly comforting, deeply protective shapes of pure, solid shadow. The towering, mathematically perfect gnomon is now merely a deeply soft, highly sloping, perfectly dark mountain, gently guarding your heavy resting rest. The deeply sunken, incredibly complex pale marble bowls are now completely vast, entirely gentle, beautifully dark valleys waiting patiently to gently cradle your deeply drifting, completely unhurried dreams. The deeply ancient, heavily textured red sandstone pillars have beautifully, softly dissolved into a completely thick, entirely protective, highly silent forest of deeply dark, perfectly resting, incredibly old trees. The entirely complete, completely heavy, profoundly beautiful erasure of the sharp, demanding waking world is finally flawlessly complete. You are completely enveloped in a profoundly deep, entirely soft, highly continuous, perfectly beautifully heavy cocoon of absolute, unwavering, deeply historical, completely eternal silence. The incredibly slow, deeply drifting motes of ancient dust continue their perfectly silent, entirely aimless dance. The heavily sleeping, completely resting earth continues its massive, incredibly slow, beautifully sweeping rotation. And you, completely untethered, entirely safe, and profoundly, beautifully heavy, are slowly, gently, completely slipping entirely away into the deeply vast, incredibly welcoming, perfectly dark ocean of an entirely untroubled, profoundly deep, and completely peaceful sleep. As you drift further and further away from the solid waking shores of conscious thought, the vast ancient architecture of the Jantar Mantar gently folds itself away, dissolving completely into the soft, welcoming fabric of the deeply resting night. The incredibly heavy, profoundly dense physical sensation of the stone beneath you has entirely vanished, replaced completely by a beautiful, weightless sensation of floating suspended within a warm, infinite, and entirely dark ocean of quiet space. The towering gnomons, the sunken marble bowls, the heavy brass discs, and the deeply aromatic, warm cooking hearth are no longer distinct physical realities. They have beautifully, seamlessly transitioned into incredibly soft, highly muted, deeply comforting emotional echoes, faint, lingering memories of perfect safety, absolute stillness, and unwavering eternal permanence. The incredibly slow, majestic turning of the cosmos above which the master astronomers spent their entire, dedicated lives struggling to meticulously measure and perfectly understand, is no longer something you need to intellectually grasp or actively observe. You are no longer watching the silent, sweeping rotation of the heavens from the outside. You have gently, beautifully, and entirely become a seamlessly integrated, deeply resting part of that exact same, unhurried, perfectly rhythmic, completely continuous celestial motion. The deeply fragrant, heavily scented midnight air, which earlier carried the sharp, complex, entirely distinct aromas of ancient crushed camphor, rich toasted wheat, oxidized copper, and intensely sweet, blooming jasmine, now simplifies itself into a single, profoundly pure, completely clean sensation. It is simply the quiet, deeply reassuring scent of the resting earth itself. It is the incredibly subtle, deeply grounding, highly comforting aroma of cold, untouched dust and completely still, incredibly heavy, perfectly sleeping air. This absolute purity of scent perfectly mirrors the profound, beautiful emptying of your entirely relaxed mind. The endless, deeply exhausting, highly frantic stream of bright, demanding, entirely sharp mental imagery that constantly plagues the waking hours has completely, entirely ceased. Your internal, deeply resting landscape is now wonderfully, beautifully, completely blank, exactly resembling a vast, perfectly smooth, incredibly dark, heavily unruffled canvas of pure, thick velvet, waiting quietly, patiently for the soft, incredibly gentle, highly abstract, beautifully illogical watercolor strokes of your impending peaceful dreams. The acoustic environment of the deeply shadowed, completely silent courtyard has also undergone a final, beautiful and profound transformation. The incredibly faint, highly delicate, deeply rhythmic whispering of the dry peepal leaves, the incredibly slow, highly comforting, entirely gentle bubbling of the hidden terracotta water channel, and even the profoundly soft, entirely microscopic, heavily rhythmic sound of the falling, crushed quartz sand in the tiny wooden hourglass have all gracefully, silently retreated. They have entirely faded completely backward, crossing far beyond the extreme, incredibly faint, highly sensitive threshold of your deeply resting, heavily tired human hearing. The silence that now remains completely wrapping around you is not merely the simple, highly fragile absence of noise. It is a deeply profound, incredibly heavy, entirely solid, highly palpable physical substance. It is a thick, deeply comforting, perfectly insulating layer of ancient, completely unbroken quiet that actively, beautifully, completely presses softly against your resting ears, completely ensuring that absolutely nothing from the distant, modern, entirely rushing world can possibly ever reach you, disturb you, or perfectly gently wake you. In this state of profound, absolute sensory quiet, the only rhythm that truly exists, the absolute only deeply sweeping motion left in the entire vast resting universe, is the incredibly slow, deeply beautiful, perfectly continuous, highly comforting rise and fall of your own resting breath. It is a profoundly deep, incredibly heavy, entirely slow, deeply oceanic tide. It washes completely slowly in, deeply filling the dark, heavy, quiet space of your resting chest with profound, perfect, entirely unshakable peace. It completely, slowly washes entirely out, gently, beautifully, completely carrying away the absolute last, microscopic, entirely invisible atom of deeply held, perfectly hidden tension. In, out, deeply slow, incredibly heavy, profoundly quiet. The rhythm perfectly, beautifully matches the completely silent, entirely unseen, perfectly continuous pulse of the heavy, sleeping desert earth perfectly resting quietly beneath the ancient, heavily plastered stone. There is absolutely nothing left for you to completely do. The massive, deeply heavy, highly ancient stone instruments of the Jantar Mantar have completely silently kept their deeply patient, entirely unwavering, completely perfect watch over the sweeping, highly distant, entirely silent stars for hundreds of deeply quiet, perfectly long, entirely sweeping years, and they will completely, peacefully, entirely continue to do so, entirely without needing your deeply tired, completely exhausted, highly resting attention. The beautiful, entirely silent, deeply majestic, perfectly rotating night sky completely holds absolutely no demanding, highly pressing secrets that you deeply need to, frantically, aggressively solve entirely before the pale, completely distant, highly approaching dawn. The deeply heavy, incredibly thick, perfectly soft, completely dark velvet curtain of the deeply ancient, entirely quiet. Midnight has completely, perfectly, entirely, heavily fallen over the glaring, highly demanding, completely exhausting stage of your entirely waking, deeply rushing life. You are completely, perfectly, entirely safe here, deeply hidden, completely sheltered, and beautifully protected within the massive, deeply warm, highly ancient stone walls of a deeply forgotten, completely silent, highly peaceful historical year. The incredibly deep, profoundly comforting, entirely vast, completely ancient, perfectly heavy silence has entirely, beautifully, completely claimed you. Just let completely go. Allow the profound, incredibly heavy, entirely comforting sensation of completely deep, entirely dark, perfectly physical, deeply profound nothingness to completely, beautifully, entirely wash perfectly over you. Sink entirely deeper into the incredibly soft, deeply dark, completely heavily resting void. Let the incredibly slow, deeply ancient, perfectly peaceful, highly sweeping rhythm of the deeply silent, entirely rotating, completely eternal cosmos carry you entirely, completely gently away. Sleep now. Deeply, perfectly, entirely deeply, completely heavily, profoundly, quietly sleep. The night will completely, perfectly, entirely, gently hold you. The ancient heavy stone will perfectly, silently, entirely safely guard you. Just deeply, quietly, perfectly, entirely sleep. Welcome to Sleepy History with Wesley, your personal sanctuary of ancient tales. Here, we blend authentic historical events with gentle AI technology to recreate immersive, soothing journeys through time. This channel is crafted specifically for relaxation and sleep support. TAND is not a substitute for professional medical advice. For your safety, please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, close your eyes and let history carry you into a peaceful sleep.